And where did you grow up, Bruce?
I grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey. Uh, I was I was born in 1945. I'm a twin. I have a twin brother who is 5 minutes older than me. Unfortunately, when we were about 2 years old, my birth mother passed away from Hodgkin's disease, and my father was left with my older brother Art, who is about almost 5 years older than my twin brother Michael and I. And he had a pretty rough time with three young kids. He he worked as a phys ed teacher almost all of his 40-year career, but he held two jobs as long as he was alive and until he retired. And then he actually would have my older brother at 7 years old after school would take over for a babysitter who was with us, the two of us during the day, but he would take up my 7-year-old would be responsible for us until my father got home at 9 o'clock at night. Today, he'd probably go to jail for doing that. But to this day, my older brother, he still has anxiety over the fact that he was responsible for us all those years. But at any rate, I grew up in Jersey City. I went to high school in Jersey City. My father taught at a different high school. But I know as we were growing up, if I did something wrong in school, he knew about it before I got home, so I could never get away with anything.
And if he was a PE teacher, I'm assuming you guys were all athletes.
My older brother and I were my twin brother. My twin brother and I, by the time we were like 10 years old, we didn't do anything together. We never dressed alike. We didn't have the same friends, and he never went out for any sports. But we all swam. My father was a waterfront guy at sleepaway camp for years and years. He was the head of a waterfront. We swam before we walked, all of us. So I swam competitively in high school. I played some competitive tennis, but not in high school. My brother played competitive tennis and swam. So we were fairly athletic, all of us. But let me think. Go ahead.
So if you were a lieutenant in the Army, you only spent 2 years in there. I'm assuming that you went to college.
Yeah, after high school, my brother and I were both going to go to Michigan State University because it was very inexpensive even for out-of-state residents. But I got a scholarship, a corporate scholarship to Rutgers University in New Jersey, which I couldn't really turn down. And so he went away to Michigan State, and I went to Rutgers and started in 1960, I guess the end of 62. So I was at Rutgers. My twin brother, I think, the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of that year came about, and my twin brother decided, after he had one trimester under his belt, that he was going to drop out of school and enlist in the Army. I thought my father would kill him, actually, but he did. He enlisted. He was an enlisted guy. He actually went to Vietnam before I did, and was there for about 9 months before he got out of the service. But I graduated from college in '66. I had worked summers for the company that gave me my scholarship, so I had some of my own savings. But when I got out, I actually the first summer I went out, I had to go to summer camp. I was supposed to go as a junior, but I blew out my knee doing something foolish, and I ended up not going until I was a senior, and had already graduated. So I did my officer basic boot camp in the summer of '66, and I went on active duty in beginning of October of '66.
So had you been doing ROTC or something? I mean,
Yeah, I was in ROTC
Okay.
the whole time I was there. So as a senior, I went through. We had a flight program at Rutgers for both the Air Force cadets and the Army cadets, and I went through a training and then had to commit to a third year, actually, with the intention of going to flight school. But when I get into the service, make a long story short, I didn't want to go to flight school and fly helicopters in Vietnam. I went on active duty at Fort Bliss, Texas, in the Air Defense Division. So that was my branch, and I had no clue about going to Vietnam. I couldn't have found Vietnam on a map, even though my brother had been there while I was in college. We never talked about it, never wrote letters. But I went to Fort Bliss and did my basic, and in beginning of January of '67, they assigned me as a battery commander, as a second lieutenant. and we had the air defense school. We had 7 batteries. They were the size of battalions, 600 guys in each battery, and I was the only junior officer there. I took over from a first lieutenant. I didn't know anything. I didn't know shit from China. I was green and never pretended to. But I had the best permanent party staff probably on the base at Fort Bliss. And Fort Bliss was a large base at the time. I think they had about 50,000 between their AITs and basic training and whatnot. But I was a company commander, it's a battery commander, and the other 6 batteries in the school were all captains. So I basically learned everything I knew in the military from my permanent party. They took great care of me, and I took whatever care of them I could. Mm-hmm. Taught me everything I ever knew.
So that was when did you say that was?
That was from the beginning of January. As soon as I got out of my officer basic, January of '67, and I had that command for the better part of 6 months. I remember I was so nervous about standing for any kind of parades or any inspections because I didn't know anything, and I wasn't one of these strack regular Army types. I remember my first sergeant used to come into my office in the morning and watch. He'd look at under my desk as he walked in the door, kind of tilt his head and look at my shoes, and he sheepishly say to me, "Lieutenant, let me have those shoes." And he would take my shoes and have one of his kids spit shine my shoes just to make sure I looked okay. But as I said, they took great care of me. It was a great unit. But sometime, I guess it was either late in June or early in July, he was a major from the Pentagon, would come around to talk to junior officers about their career opportunities. And my MOS was Nike Hercules missiles. So I expected I was going to go to Europe with a warhead team or something, and I'm looking forward to going. And when I told him I was hoping to go to Europe, he laughed at me. He said, "Lieutenant, you're not going anywhere. You're on a 2-year stabilized tour at Fort Bliss." And I kind of sulked a little bit, but then I realized I have a great job here. I was playing golf 2 or 3 days a week. One of my commanders always asked me to play golf with him. I was dating all the colonel's daughters, so it was really great,
And is your brother in Vietnam while all this golf and dating is going on?
No, he was home by '67. He was there he was there from May of '65 till February of '66 when he got out of the Army. He went over there with no base camp. He was in 101st Airborne, and he went over with the original air mobile units they formed from some of the different divisions to scout out hilltops in the Central Highlands, basically, so that when the first Cav came over there with their thousands of helicopters, they had safe places to land. So that was his job, basically, is to go around with this unit, checking out hilltops and whatnot. But at any rate, I saw, as I said, I sulked a little bit and said, "Well, I'm going to be here. This is not bad at all." And then his trail was not even cold. I think 4 or 5 days later, I come to my unit at like 5:30 in the morning, and my operations sergeant's standing out on the porch. My parking space is right there, and I said, "Geez, what the hell happened to you last night? Did they have a riot? Did they tear the building apart?" Couldn't understand why he was out there, but he had a cup of coffee in one hand and some papers in the other. So I walked up on the porch. He hands me the cup of coffee, puts his hand on my shoulder and said, "Lieutenant, you better come in and sit down." And he had my orders for Vietnam in his other hand. So farthest thing from my mind. I mean, I knew the unit I was going to. All of the other officers that I lived with in the BOQ, with the exception of my roommate, were in the training units for these weapons that were going over. I don't know if I had told you, but we had they were Korean War, designed for Korean War. They were light tanks, M41 tanks with twin 40mm cannons mounted in an open turret on top, and we had these training units at Fort Bliss that they'd taken this equipment back from the National Guard, actually, because they never got to Korea. The war was over by the time they were finished building these things. So, but all the training units were at Fort Bliss, and all of the other officers that I lived with were in these training units, training guys for the dusters, which we called these M42A1s, which is what they were with this configuration on top. And we had for each of the 3 battalions they were training, we had a battery of quad 50 machine guns, which were mounted in the back of Deuce electric turret quad 50 machine guns. And I think, I'm not sure whether they trained these there or not, but there was a searchlight battery attached to each of our 3 battalions as well. So they trained there. And I remember probably within 2 weeks after I got my orders, I was assigned to go to this automatic weapons course for 30 days, which was, taught us what we were supposed to learn about this equipment. I was still in shock for that 30 days. I didn't get over the fact that I was going to Vietnam, and I didn't really want to go. But at any rate, I went to school with my new battalion commander in Vietnam, with a lot of battery commanders. We were all in the same class. And, at the end of August, we all went home on leave. It was on leave for 30 days during the month of September. And I was on my way, to Vietnam, beginning of 1st of October. So I knew exactly where I was going. I knew the unit I was going to. When I was home on leave, I used to sit on my dad's sofa or couch in his den, and we'd watch the evening 6 o'clock news. And during the summer, right through to November, actually, but certainly in September while we were there, we literally watched my unit get the crap kicked out of them with the 3rd Marine Division on the DMZ. We were stationed on the demilitarized zone. So, I would sit there, thinking to myself, there can't be anything positive about me telling him that I'm going to be there, because he didn't have any idea where I was going. He thought I'd be safe with the kind of unit I was with. But that's basically, how it led up to, my going to Vietnam. We never talked about flight school. I knew I wasn't going to go. I think when they first asked me about it, when I was back at Bliss, because I owed them an extra year, a 3rd year, because I got my private pilot's license as a cadet. And basically, I said to them, when they asked me about flight school, I said, I want to go to fixed wing school, because I surely didn't want to fly helicopters in Vietnam. And I remember the guy giggled and laughed when I said, he said, Lieutenant, the only chance you have of flying fixed wing in the Army is after you get back from Vietnam, having flown Hueys, and then you might be lucky enough to get a cross-trained in fixed wing aircraft.
Yeah.
But that's when I made my decision. I was not going to go to flight school, because I surely wasn't. I was a decent pilot, but I wasn't going to fly helicopters no matter what. So I ended up going. I was in Vietnam the first week in October. Went right to my unit. We were up on the DMZ, as I told you. I landed in Cam Ranh Bay, and I flew. Was it Cam Ranh Bay? Yeah, we landed in Cam Ranh Bay, and
Hey,
the
Bruce,
next day,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but whatever, I can't see what's going on down there, but if you're shuffling papers or whatever, the mic is picking it up.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I had some notes in my hand, but
yeah, it's just I'm gonna.
Okay, no problem.
I won't be able to edit that out. I think I don't have that kind of skill.
Okay.
So you landed in Cam Ranh Bay.
Yeah, I landed in Cam Ranh Bay. I left out of Fort Lewis, Washington, and I remember.
That's where I live.
I mean,
I live. Well, I live north of Fort Lewis. I live. Of course, now it's Lewis McChord.
Right.
Right. And I live. I live about 25 miles directly east of Seattle.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with Seattle. At any rate, I remember walking out on the blacktop, and there was a charter SeaWorld Airways, it was called. It was a charter flight. And I was one of the few Army guys going to the Marine, literally to a Marine battalion, a Marine division rather. And I remember before I got on those steps going up, I dropped down on the ground, kissed the asphalt, because I didn't think I was coming back. I was absolutely certain that I was not going to be coming back alive. And got on that flight, and of course we flew. Had the sun in my eyes for God knows how many hours, because we were flying with the sun to Japan. Went to Japan, and we went to. I think we went from Japan. I think we flew straight into Cam Ranh Bay, if I'm not mistaken. But I got little flight hops. I'd take my orders and I'd go to the airfield at Cam Ranh Bay. They'd look at my orders and think I was crazy because I was going up to the DMZ. And at each stop, I flew to Nha Trang, and then Quy Nhon, and then Phu Bai. And at each stop, when I'd hand somebody my orders, they'd look at me like I was crazy, because they'd point out to the runway, and there were silver caskets out there with Marine bodies from kids that were killed, very recently.
Mhm.
And that was my basic invitation to going up where I went. Landed in Dong Ha, had no idea where I was, and found a lift to my battalion headquarters.
So, can you explain why? I mean, you were going to basically a Marine base. What would
Yeah,
can you explain a little bit about what the Marines were doing there and what the Army's role was?
yeah. Well, the Third Marine Division was on the DMZ, and as I said, we had 3 battalions that went over. My battalion was the first to go over in I believe in October of '66. They went over with their first crew, and they landed in Queen Yan. They had all their tanks and their attached quad 50s, and they shortly thereafter moved them up to the DMZ, to the Third Marine Division base, which was located at Dong Ha in Vietnam, Dong Ha was only about 10, 12 kilometers below the DMZ. But it was a sprawling base that they had there, and they had any of their attached uh, units. And there were other Army units there. We had artillery units. We had 175s were there. I think it was the first or second of the 94th Artillery. But my unit, as I said, it was a battalion of dusters of these tanks, light tanks. Each battalion had 64 tanks, 4 firing batteries of 16 each, and we had an attached quad 50 battery. In this case, my battalion, by the way, was the 1st Battalion, 44th Artillery, AWSP, which was automatic weapons, self-propelled. And as I said, these were light Walker Bulldog tanks, thin-skinned, 3/8-inch armor, open turret on top, no real protection. And quite frankly, a 50 caliber machine gun would make it look like a piece of Swiss cheese. And worse yet, it was a gasoline engine. Why in hell they made the tank with gasoline engines is beyond me, because it took virtually nothing. You could hit any one of a million places on this tank and get it to catch fire with gasoline engine and hoses that were easily broken. So we burned up more than a few of them in attacks. But at any rate, we had the quad 50s there. The only thing that wasn't there were the searchlights. The Marine Corps didn't want the searchlights up there for, I guess, obvious reasons. They didn't want to be pointing out wherever the heck they were located, and they were stationed down at Da Nang around the airfield. But we were there basically as support for the Third Marine Division and all of their regiments. We were spread out almost like it was almost like a taxi cab company that was sending cabs all over the place. We would go in very small groups. I don't think we ever had more than 2 dusters and 2 quad 50s at any one position. And more often than not, we had only 2 dusters. But we were at all the fire bases along the DMZ, from the South China Sea all the way up into the mountains in Khe Sanh. But we were heavy fire support. We defended these bases at night, and in the morning we'd go out with a Marine CB construction group with mine detectors, and we'd go sweep the mines, and we'd meet up with 2 dusters or quads coming from the other direction, from wherever they were, and sweep the mines every morning, every day that I was there, basically. And but during the day, we would go out on operations with them. If they had an offensive operation and there were roads to get there, even dirt roads, for the most part, these could go on roads and over some brush. But they weren't going through rice paddies or climbing mountains or anything. They weren't capable of that. But on the roads, they were pretty awesome. They could do upwards of 50 miles an hour on the highways. Dirt highways, unfortunately, up there were no paved roads. But as long as we could move somewhere, we would provide security for the Marines. Besides those kinds of operations, we would always provide security for any convoys that were moving from Dong Ha north to the other fire bases and back. So we were pretty busy, but for the most part, it was a lot of sitting around, other than defending the places at night, and with very, very small crews. These weapons, there were crew served weapons with a driver and an NCO, and then supposedly 4 people up top. There should have been 6 men on each. I don't think we ever had more than 5, and more often than not, we were lucky if we had 5. But when I rode with them, I was basically a sixth gunner of some sort. I would grab we had 30 caliber machine gun on top as well, and because we were targets. I mean, when the North Vietnamese realized the kind of firepower these weapons had, more than anything the Marines had. One or two Dusters had more firepower than a Marine weapons platoon, and the guns had they had a range of over 3 miles, and they were point detonating rounds. They were designed to shoot aircraft down and to explode when they reached 3.5, 4 miles. They would break up into shrapnel, but they were point detonating. Anything you hit, these would blow up, and the blast was the equivalent of a large, maybe 2 hand grenade blast. It could be anywhere from 20 meters wide to 40 meters long, the shrapnel blast. So they were awesome weapons, and they were all tracer rounds. So you didn't miss I mean, you might miss with the first round, you didn't miss with the second one. So they were awesome weapons. And then everybody knows what a 50 caliber machine gun can do. Imagine 4 of them mounted on an electric turret, the firepower there. So a Duster could fire from each gun 120 rounds a minute. So that's 240 rounds a minute. If you were firing constantly, you'd run out of ammunition in 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. You could only carry so much. But the quads always had a lot of ammunition, and I guess each 50 caliber, I think, could fire about 750 rounds a minute. Normally, they'd fire them 2 at a time, so they didn't burn up barrels. But they were awesome weapons. And when the Marines finally realized how to use them, they were very, very convenient for them. It took a long time when I got over there, even though they'd been there for a year. The Marines had no clue how these weapons should be used. They wanted us to they thought they were like amphibious vehicles, but we should take them through the rice paddies and whatnot. And I had more than a few run-ins with Marine captains, majors, even lieutenant colonels who were battalion commanders. And they'd say, "Oh, we're going to go through these rice paddies and take that." They thought they were fighting World War II, storming beaches with fixed bayonets. And I would, as a first lieutenant, I would tell them, I said, "Look," I said, "with all due respect, these are not amphibious vehicles. We can't go through those rice paddies." And they'd argue a bit. And I said, "Look, call down to Marine headquarters, speak to nobody below the rank of the commandant or the assistant commandant, and ask them or tell them what you're telling me, and I will do whatever they tell you." Because I knew what they were going to tell them. They were going to tell him, "You better listen to this lieutenant, or he'll be out the gate with those 2 weapons, and they'll be at the next position because there are people begging to have them with them every day." And after a while, they realized that how they should be used. So there were often times that they were going to storm a hill somewhere, and I would tell them, I said, "What's the target? And tell me where the target is." And we have a range of 3.5 miles. Why would you want to send these kids up, fixed bayonets up the hill? Let us fire a couple of 100 rounds on there. We'll mess everything up, and then you can go clean up afterwards. And that's basically what we did a lot of the time. If they got ambushed, we could break an ambush up as long as we fired our weapons, in 30 seconds. But they became targets real early, unfortunately. And the first weapons, they would fire their RPGs at us. They would try and have little guys running up with satchel charges to toss them up into the turret. So they were such targets that our greatest fear was that they would either get hit by an RPG. RPGs were devastating. But one of my jobs was to get on that machine gun or whatever weapon I had, shoot out whoever was jumping out of the weeds with an RPG or a satchel charge, basically. Unfortunately, in my tour, I didn't have that problem. I think I was in maybe 2 minor ambushes. So it was definitely a harrowing kind of a job.
So when did you arrive in Khe Sanh, and what were the circumstances of your arriving there?
Well, I was with Bravo Battery when I got there in October, and I was with Bravo Battery for 3 months, and my guns were all located at Con Tien and a hill called Cam Lo, which was Con Tien was the hottest spot on the DMZ. at that time, all through the summer and well, even into November. At Con Thien, there were North Vietnamese were coming into the wire in that position. But I was there with them on it between there and Cam Lo, which was basically a supply hill I think about 6 or 7 kilometers south of Con Thien for 3 months. And then around the first of the year, there was something took place with one of the other batteries, and where they were accompanying a convoy, and they got ambushed, and they didn't fire a round from the Dusters. And the battalion commander decided to move me from my battery over to Alpha Battery, where this took place, and take over that platoon, and which I did. And it just bugged the crap out of me, because the most important thing on a crew served weapon is everybody's got to be there and do their job, or you're all dead. And you can't fire these guns with 2 guys. You have to have 4 guys loading, 2 guys loading, 2 guys directing fire. So I read those kids the riot act the first day I was there. I went into their bunk, and I said to them, "Look, you won't have to worry about getting shot, by the enemy." I said, "If any one of you guys decides to jump off that vehicle, I will put a bullet in your back." I said, "That's not going to happen with us. We depend on each other. Our lives depend on each other, and all these Marines depend on us. So we have a job to do, and you got to do your job, whether you're scared or not." And basically, they pretty much came around right away. So it was not a bad change for me. But so I was with this Alpha Battery from the first of the year. The first week we were there, they got the 3rd Marines got intelligence that there were Russian Ilyushin bombers were going to test the air defenses on the DMZ. And I would say to myself, what air defense? I mean, we were designed to shoot down 300-mile-an-hour aircraft in Korea, and the Ilyushin bombers are flying, at Mach speeds. And every one of us knew that we actually deployed in an air defense array around 3rd Marines, the Dong Ha positions. And we would just think, my God, if they're really flying bombers in at us, the only way you could shoot down a bomber with these weapons would be if they were flying straight in at you. And then if they were flying straight in at you, you were the target. It was really, we did this for 3 days. We hung out there 24 hours a day for 3 days. And finally they realized there is no threat. They're not going to fly airplanes down here. They get shot out of the air by missiles or whatever. At any rate, from that, the very next week, I got sent to a position up on the DMZ that was located. Con Thien was located before you got to the mountains. There was another position on Route 1, which was about 10 kilometers east of Con Thien on the southern boundary of the DMZ, which was called Jiolin. It was a larger position. They had heavy artillery there, which we did not have at Con Thien. And they decided there was so much infiltration coming between those 2 positions, 10 kilometers of a long distance, that they would build a small fire base there. And in December, before I actually went up there, the Seabees built this relatively small hilltop position, had gazillion mines around it, and they had about 6 or 8 huge 24-foot square bunkers that they built. They were incredibly safe. They could take a direct hit from a lot of weapons and not be seriously damaged. But it was called Alpha 3, and it was located at a route that would come right down and go straight down to the village, the town of Cam Lo, which was, the next major village besides Dong Ha, along Route 9. And so we were there to defend that position and, keep infiltrators from coming down, which we did. So I was there for most of the month of January, and then into February, early in February, probably I'm thinking about the 2nd week in February. I remember a lieutenant from headquarters battery came up in a Jeep, big grin on his face, and drove up to my position in this fire base. And he said to me, "Lieutenant, I have good news for you and bad news for you." And he said, "What do you want to hear first?" And I said, "Well, give me the good news." He said, "Your R&R has been canceled." Because I was supposed to go on R&R shortly thereafter. And I said, "And the bad news?" He said, "You're going up to Khe Sanh tomorrow." And by then we knew this was middle of February. The first attack at Khe Sanh was on the 21st of January.
Mhm.
And so we all knew what was going on at Khe Sanh. And I said, geez, my battalion commander he must want to get me killed. And he's sending me, there were lots of lieutenants in air defense units in the Army. There were second lieutenants that were back in the rear area all the time. I never understood why they weren't out at some of these fire bases. At any rate, I went back with him, and the next day I had 3 guys that were going to replace people that were up at Khe Sanh. One from the Quad 50 battery and two of my platoon guys. And we went to the airport, and we tried to get a ride up to Khe Sanh. And at that time, Khe Sanh was really under heavy attack. The Battle of Hue was going on in February, and nothing was flying into Khe Sanh because they were getting shot out of the air. It was really bad news for aircraft going in there. And so we tried to get out of Dong Ha, couldn't get out of Dong Ha. We hitched a ride with the Marine company that was flying down where was it? Down to Quang Tri Airfield, actually, and they were building an airfield there. Couldn't get a ride out of there, and hitched another ride the following day down to Phu Bai. And at Phu Bai, we sat on the runway literally in the hot sun for almost 3 days, every day trying to get a ride out. Nothing going to Khe Sanh until the last day. And I remember it was a CH-53 Sea Stallion, big, great helicopter, dropped down, dropped his rear deck, and a Jeep rolled off. Some guys got off of there, and they waved us onto the helicopter. I had my 3 guys, and there were at least a dozen or more, grunts that were going up as replacements to Khe Sanh. And strangely enough, the crew chief was a master gunnery sergeant, and the pilot was a major. Unheard of that they would be flying this aircraft. But I didn't know it at the time. This was a mercy mission, basically a volunteer mission. They were going into Khe Sanh to pick up a lot of wounded and dead Marines, basically. And I remember we get on the helicopter, and this big gruff gunnery sergeant said to us was, "You guys get all your gear on the floor and get on top of it, because when we get to Khe Sanh and start coming down through the ceiling, they're going to start firing their 51 calibers at the sound of our engines." And every one of us had the exact same thought at the same time. There is nothing in my bag that I'm carrying that's going to stop a 51 caliber round from coming through and hitting me. So we were all kind of terrified, and he was absolutely right. Fortunately, it was a day where the ceiling over Khe Sanh was only a couple of 100 feet. And as soon as they heard engines coming over the base, they started shooting at us. We were watching green tracers coming up through the windows all over the place. We got down, and he actually never landed. What he did was he hovered, dropped his tailgate, and literally dumped us, all of us, out the back like a garbage truck would empty out, because he couldn't land. There were rounds hitting all around him, and he would get shot down if he stayed there much more than he did. And we all scrambled like rats into the trenches around the helicopter landing area, and they never picked up any dead or wounded that were waiting to get on this helicopter. But we were terrified, and of course none of us had been there before, so we didn't know where we were going, where anything was. But with my guys, we stayed in that trench line probably 40 minutes after the incoming stopped, because we were kind of terrified. I wasn't getting up there not knowing where I had to go. So but we finally found out where my guns were, and our guns were located along the northern perimeter. The hill at Khe Sanh, it was basically a plateau surrounded by much superior mountains. And the north perimeter, the runway ran basically east to west, little southeast to northwest, but almost east-west. And in front of us, probably 2.5 miles away, were these 2 huge mountaintops. One was a hill 950 where we actually had microwave radio installation there, and the one next to it, which was superior, we called 1050, and we endearingly, it was this bump on the top of a mountain, endearingly called it the witch's tip. And which to this day, that's how the grunts refer to it. But that was an enemy hill, and they had for observers there. We would watch in the mountains, the hills that leading up to them. We would watch elephants moving through the brush that were carrying, heavy weapons for the North Vietnamese. But we were surrounded. This was by the way, this was not the 3rd Marine Division. This was the 26th Marines, and they were there supported by the 9th Marines, which were one company of the 9th Marines, which was 1-9, and I believe there may have been one other unit. There was some Army, attachments there, signal people. But we were surrounded by the better part of 3 divisions of North Vietnamese, which with a 4th division in reserve. And those divisions, just without any of their attachments, were 8,000 men. With their attachments, there easily could have been 30,000 to 40,000 North Vietnamese surrounding the base of Khe Sanh. We also had, the Marines had several hilltops. There was Hill 869 that had Marines from the, I believe they were, I want to say 326. I'm not certain, but Hill 881 had another, a couple of platoons of Marines. And I think there was a 3rd, I can't remember, Hill 554 maybe. But these were outlying. They were several miles away from Khe Sanh, but they were literally in the path of where North Vietnamese would have to come through in order to get to the base. And basically, we were pretty certain that the North Vietnamese were building up because they wanted to make it another Dien Bien Phu, which was coming real close. I think the anniversary was in March. And so we were basically lined up with I had 2 Dusters and 2 Quad 50s. And the runway there was about 3,500 feet long along the northern perimeter. So this base was pretty large. It was about 3/4 of a mile, I would think, long, not quite a mile long, by 1/3 of a mile wide. But we were on the north side, and we were wired off. Literally, they had barbed wire behind us, between us and the runway. And I guess their feeling was, if we had tremendous fields of fire in front of us. It was the only grassy flat area that ran for probably, I would say, at least a half a mile out toward a ravine, which the Rao Quan River was the river that ran through a ravine north of us. And they had plenty of cover behind this grassy plateau. But we had an open field of fire from one end of the runway to the other. There was only one company of Marines there, spread out over 3/4 of a mile. So that it was thinly defended. I had my 2 guns at the Duster and a Quad 50, maybe 50 meters apart at the west end of the runway, and I had the same going on near the east end of the runway, and I had a little bunker kind of right behind one of the Quad 50s on the east end of the runway. So we were there basically to be main firepower. The only other firepower they had, the Marines had, I don't know if you know what an Ontos is. An Ontos was a little Marine tracked vehicle that had 6 106 recoilless rifles mounted on it, 3 on each side of it over the tracks. And 106 recoil is a pretty big round, a recoilless rifle. It's an anti-tank weapon. Problem with it was you couldn't fire. Anybody behind you was in danger. If you fired it, you couldn't be anywhere near the back of it. Within a couple of 100 meters, you get blasted. The blast going out the rear end would blow you away. But there was the only openings in the wire to get to the rest across the runway to the rest of the base was at each of the ends. And my bunker literally was 50 feet from one of the Ontos. It was the only opening in the barbed wire. And I remember every night before dark, I would walk before going back near my bunker. I would go over and talk to these Ontos guys and say, look, if you're going to fire that thing, don't fire in that direction and don't fire in this direction. You're going to blow my bunker away. And it was kind of a joke every time I would go over there, but it really would happen. The blast that came out the back would easily knock something out that was 50 feet away. But they stuck one of these in each of the openings near each end of those were the only openings in the wire. And the objective of having them there was, well, should they overrun the one company Marines and our guns that come over the wire, there'll at least be more barbed wire. And then they've got one of these things that they could fire at point blank range at them. And I think by that time they actually had beehive rounds for these things. I don't know if you know what a beehive round is. Well, a beehive round was basically a huge block of darts. And 106, if you know what a 106 looks like, that's a very big round. It's like 6-8 inches across in diameter. But instead of having a projectile that was basically an anti-tank weapon, it was loaded with these darts, little tiny 1-inch aluminum or steel darts, tens of thousands of them in each round. And the object was, it was like a big shotgun, basically. So if anything came, if you fired one of these rounds, anything that was anywhere near it in front of it, these darts would just completely shred them. And that was basically the only defense on the north side, because they realized it wasn't, even though it was the easiest avenue of approach, it wasn't a likely avenue of approach if they were going to try to overrun the base. They had much more cover almost anywhere else around the base than that side. So I remember when I first or second day I was there, the only time I ever went to their headquarters bunker, the Marine commander, Colonel Lowndes, had his cadre in an old French bunker that was located kind of right in the center on the south side of the runway. And I remember going over there, the only time I ever saw him in the 7 weeks I was there, just to report in basically. And I told him I was the new officer in charge of the weapons, and he looked at me and he said, "Lieutenant," he said, if they trying to overrun us on that north perimeter, can you hold them off?" And I looked at straight. I didn't know what to say. I looked him straight in the eye and I said, "Yes, sir, we can do that." And that was it. I've never seen him again. I never saw any of his cadre again the whole time I was there, because nobody was really walking around too much at Khe Sanh. Every day there was incoming. And probably the only time we didn't have incoming the 7 weeks I was there was at night, with the exception of one night. But during the day, if it was clear, you were targets. If there was snipers all over the place, they would fire mortars. They would fire every artillery piece that they had was targeted at this hill, and everything was zeroed in. Not only from the north and from the west, but from the west, farther to the west than the hilltops. There was right across the Laotian border, there was a ridge called Khe Rock Ridge. And Khe Rock Ridge was this sheer granite face facing the east that it was probably, I would say, a third of a mile long, this ridge. And the North Vietnamese, the backside was not granite, but the front side was all granite. But they literally dug tunnels in the backside, blew out holes in the front side, and they had their big guns. They had 151 millimeter guns, which is a big 20-mile range cannon. They had 130s, also had a long range, and they had their 122s, which were low trajectory, very high speed rounds. And they had these things. They would roll them out of the hole, out of this tunnel, either on tracks or whatever. They'd roll them out to the hole, fire the weapons, and then roll them back in again. And there was no way, we weren't allowed to go into Laos to bomb them. And even if we had weapons that could fire at them, they were ingenious. They had baffles in these little tunnels so that the blast wouldn't go all the way through the tunnel. But they had at least 15 to 20 of these holes with guns in them, and they had all the hilltops and the base zeroed in. So we would get hit every day by long range artillery, by short range, by rockets, you name it. There were always a couple of hundred rounds every single day, or more. And so it was a dangerous place. You couldn't get up and walk from one place to another above ground unless it was foggy. And if we were fogged in, that was the only time you could get up and do work on the equipment or go, pick up supplies if there were any. When it cleared, you better stay in your hole because you're going to get shot at. And I know one of the things our guys always did was we'd get, in a clear day, we would get up and with binoculars scan that whole plateau out in front of us in the grass, because they had snipers in these, they call them spider holes. They were literally in a hole in the ground, only big enough for one guy and his rifle, and they had these little bamboo camouflage tops on them, and they would literally lift the front edge up as a spider would coming out of a spider trap, and pick out a target and shoot at it, and then go back in again. And we used to scan every day. We would scan this plateau to find them. Occasionally we would see one, and we'd fire 25 rounds into his hole. But it was very dangerous. And my guys, more so than the Marines, knew. I had told them, you don't ever get out of that hole. And if you see me getting up, if you see me dive to the ground, you better be on your way to the ground, because my senses, I could tell you what caliber of round it was coming out of the tube when they fired these artillery pieces. And you only had seconds between the round coming out of the tube that you could hear and the round landing. Other than their 122 cannon, it was like the Germans had an 80 millimeter and a 122 millimeter. I don't know if this was a German gun. It was probably Russian, but it was a low trajectory rifled round, and it was high speed, unlike the howitzer type guns that were high altitude launches. This thing would fire in a low trajectory, and you were lucky if you had 3 seconds from the time it came out of the tube to the time the round hit. That's how fast it was. So it was boom, boom, and scary sound. Rockets, also very scary. Rockets rarely hit what they were trying to hit, aimed at. They were kind of terror weapons, because they weren't accurate at all. But when you have a big base like that, you aim at the base somewhere, or aim at the middle of it, and the rocket's going to hit somewhere there. And when they came in, they sounded like a freight train. If you were standing next to a railroad track and a freight train went by, that's what they screeched in like a high-speed train going by. So it was pretty frightening. But that was our existence. Like, I was there. I flew in there on the 25th of February. And one thing I forgot to say, when I got there, I didn't realize it at the time until literally a couple of days later. The reason that helicopter was going in was there was the first patrol that they were sending out outside the wire from Bravo Company of Bravo 126. They sent out a platoon with a lieutenant, and he had orders to stay close to the perimeter. They had intelligence. They heard movement from NVA troops and whatnot, and they were going out there just to basically on a recon mission. They weren't even supposed to engage the North Vietnamese if they found them. And unfortunately, this lieutenant fell for the biggest trap they had. They saw 2 or 3 black pajama guys running away from them, and literally went after them. He sent his guys right after them, and they just ran into a battalion-sized ambush, and all but about six or seven of the guys in that platoon were wiped out. That was why this helicopter was flying in, to pull out the wounded and the dead from this unit. I did not know that until days later, because it was it was a pretty sullen couple of days around there, because they'd lost so many guys. But I found out that's the reason we flew in there, was because that helicopter was going to pick them up. But they were wiped out. In fact, from that point on, the Bravo battery had almost all new kids coming in from the States, the untrained, minimally trained kids coming in. So it was a pretty scary time. But if you have any other questions about?
Just remind me how long you were there.
I'm sorry?
I was just asking you too sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Can you remind me how long you were in Khe Sanh?
I was there. I flew in on the 25th of February, and the siege was lifted, and I took the first convoy out of there on the 14th of April. I was there for just about 7 weeks. It was a pretty tough 7 weeks. I mean, they were tough. Fortunately, there was resupply from aircraft. Unfortunately, they were shooting the fixed wing, the C-130s and 123s were the cargo planes that were trying to fly in there. Occasionally, there would be one other type of fixed wing Army plane that went in, but they stopped flying in C-130s because they were shooting them, literally shooting them out of the air, or shooting them as soon as they were on the ground. 123s were a little quicker and could get on and off the runway a little bit quicker, so they continued, although not very often, flying them in there. And they actually tried shortly after I was there. They had two types of things they were trying. Rather than land the 130s on the runway, one of them was called LAPES, LAPES, low altitude parachute extraction system. They would fly like less than 10 feet off the runway, and when they got to a certain point, with the back deck open, they would throw the parachutes out the back, and when they opened up, they would drag these pallets, which were on rollers, drag them out the back of the runway. They did that maybe once or twice at the most, but I think the second time they tried that, they had a load of 105 artillery rounds on pallets, which were very heavy, obviously, and the pallets literally skidded all the way down off the west end of the runway and took out a bunker of, I think it killed 2 or 3 Marines, a bunker that was at the end of the runway. So they stopped doing that because they really couldn't control where these things were going. The second thing they tried was like on an aircraft carrier. They had they strung a cable, an arresting cable, like an aircraft carrier would have, across the runway, and they mounted each end in, and they had this cable there. What they didn't realize was the guys who put the cables in didn't know what the heck they were doing. And those things would have to have been cemented in there and whatnot. And the first time they flew one over there, they would throw out a hook basically to catch the cable, and the arresting cable would drag the stuff out. Well, the first time they did that, both of the implanted ends of the cable came out of the ground. Well, they dragged that with, and they dragged this arresting cable as this C-130 flew off with this hanging off the back of it. So they realized this was not going to work either. And finally, they realized the only way they could resupply this base was to fly. They would fly over the runway from east to west, and when they got near the end of the runway, they would just literally point their nose with full throttle up in the air, and they would send these things at the supplies, palleted supplies, out on parachutes. And it was basically a parachute drop with dozens of pallets coming out that way. And they would drop them just around the west end of the perimeter, and the grunts would have to go out there and salvage up all this stuff. Some of which they didn't get, some of which they did get. But that's how they resupplied us for much of the last few weeks of the siege. Helicopters could come in and out, but they only stayed on the ground for about 20 or 30 seconds. They would land, empty what they could, usually personnel, and take off. If any aircraft stayed on the ground for more than 30 seconds, they were in serious risk of getting blown up. Because as soon as they knew as soon as they saw these flights coming in, they'd start firing artillery and mortars and you name it at them. And they did shoot down a few of them. I had one C-123 that was shot down, was right across the runway from my bunker near the west end of the runway, right next to their ammo dump. And one day, it was in March, and I can't remember how late. It was kind of late in March. The first C-130 that was coming into land, since they stopped flying the 130s. And I remember standing out there and watching this thing come on final approach from the east. I had my camera with me and whatnot. And wow, this is great. I'm watching him land. He goes by because I'm only maybe 10 or 15 meters off the runway where we were wired off from the runway. And I watched this plane go by, and it was really exciting. I'm snapping pictures of it. And all of a sudden he gets near the west end of the runway, and the mortars start coming in. And the mortars blew out his left landing gear, and the right wing at the end of the runway just swung around. They had big forklifts. They were that the Air Force guys were using was waiting to unload this thing, and the right wing just clipped the mast of this big forklift and blew up, and fire engulfed the thing. And in the next 20 seconds, this thing was completely engulfed with flames. Evidently, the crews got out unharmed and whatnot. The fire guys came out and foamed the whole runway, but obviously this aircraft was finished. And so I have very good pictures. I actually ran down the runway, and I had pictures of this fireman, trying to save this aircraft. But that was the only. I don't think they flew anything else in there for the rest of the siege. I think this was somewhere around the end of March, maybe the 1st of April. But this was going to be it before the end of the siege. So other than a couple of very hairy nights and days, that was pretty much our existence there. So
what do you remember about the day you left?
Well, the day I left, before we get to the day I left, the worst night we had there, at least where I was, it was the 22nd. I had my 23rd birthday on the 20th of March. And I remember I had one of the Quad 50 NCOs, this very strange guy. We had a 2-man bunker, and I slept on top, he slept on the bottom. And the guy was really strange. Nobody liked him from his unit. He didn't talk to anybody, but we lived together for 7 weeks. And I remember the two of us, I had brought a bottle of Black Label Scotch up with me. Why I put that in my bag, I don't know. But I celebrated with him, and we drank a good bottle of Scotch on my birthday. But the 22nd of March, we have been on 100% alert, because it was about the anniversary of Dien Bien Phu, and the intelligence saw the buildup of troops, and they were absolutely convinced that we were very close to, a full out attack on the base, trying to overrun the base. And on the 22nd of March, and this was the only time I remember my whole trip there that we had incoming other than that aircraft at night. And we didn't fly anything at night in there. And tactical air didn't fly because the weather wasn't good enough for them to fly. But that evening, probably around 7 at night, they started shooting at us with their artillery rounds and mortars and whatnot. And all hell broke loose. And I was, other than the Quad 50 that was 50 meters in front of me, and a Duster that was maybe 100 meters further to the east, we didn't use the radio. I wouldn't let my guys use the radio, because I was convinced that the North Vietnamese, if we did sit reps from our weapons, they would triangulate and know exactly where we were, and we'd become an instant target. So we had landlines that ran to each of the vehicles all the way down the runway, 3/4 of a mile down the runway, and that's how we communicated. And if we had to send sit reps, we voiced them to the company commander's guy in his bunker, and they would send them back to Dong Ha. But at any rate, this night we were under attack, and it was heavy, and nothing that I'd ever seen before, even having been at Con Thien. But I was really nervous. I wanted to make sure my guys were getting up on the guns, because we were going to get attacked. We were going to overrun, and the only way we could prevent that was with our guns. So I remember being at the doorway. We had little steps going into my bunker, and I was at the top step, and this sergeant is hanging on to my belt behind me, and I'm just nervous as hell. Rounds blowing up all over the place, and I know we had to get to the guns. So it seemed like hours, and it was basically seconds or minutes. And finally, I said, "We got to go," and I ran. I sent him down to the Duster. I ran up to the Quad 50 to make sure these guys were up on the guns and ready to fire. And they were already on the guns. But I didn't know what was going on down the other end of the runway. I had lost the landline had been blown up. I couldn't communicate with them. So I started, while he went down the other way, I started to make my way down the trench line. And the Charlie Company's CP bunker, this was a brand new bunker, by the way. Their original CP bunker had been blown up a little more than a month early, took a direct hit. They, I think their gunnery sergeant was killed. Their CO, a captain, had his arm amputated, and a radio operator was killed. And I found out later that their other radio operator had been resting. The guy that was at the radio at the time the direct hit had said to him, take an extra 20 minutes, I'll stay here, get some rest, because he was going to be on the rest of the night. And now this was on the 15th of February, I think, and they took a direct hit, and these 3 guys were killed. And the one survivor was the radio guy who was supposed to be at his radio and was not. And of course, now 5 weeks later, right in front of me, I was no more than 50 meters from their bunker, and I'm moving down the trench line, and right in front of me, I watch a direct hit this bunker. Big round. I thought it might have been a rocket. It was at least a big 150 artillery round, but it hit it and it literally destroyed it. And immediately started, the flames started burning it up. And I ran toward it. A couple of other grunts from the company ran toward it, and the bunker, the sandbags were smoldering. It was literally on fire. So we started pulling off sandbags and whatnot. And I realized that we were calling for a corpsman. The corpsmen had their hands full. We couldn't get a corpsman because they were already taking care of guys that were injured. And I thought to myself, these guys are going to die here unless we get a corpsman. And I knew exactly where the opening in the wire was. So while these guys continued to pull sandbags off and try to pull, there were about 10 or 12 guys in this bunker that when it got hit. And I realized that if we didn't get a corpsman there were guys going to die because they're seriously injured guys there. So I took off, got out of the trench, and I knew where the opening was, where the Antros was, and I ran like crazy, crossed the runway because I knew where the Charlie Med was, the aid station, and I just had to get guys over there, and I ran screaming toward this aid station. I got knocked off my feet twice on the way over, rounds hitting the runway, just the impact of the rounds hitting the runway. Two corpsmen heard me, fortunately, before I got there, and they ran after, came back, and we ran back through the same way I came, and they did get to these guys. And at the time, I didn't know how many guys were seriously injured or killed, and I still had to we're still under fire here. I had to get past this, down the runway, 3/4 of a mile to my other guns, which I made my way very slowly down there and eventually got there. And these guys were up on the guns waiting for an attack also to fire. And the Marines always thought we were nuts because, the first place they would go when incoming came is they either get in the bunker or in the trench, get their heads down. Of course, when you're up above on a crew served weapon, you got to get up on the weapon to fire it. And they used to joke with us, and they would say, how do they get you guys in these units? And you get up on the weapons when incoming comes in. What do? Pick the dumbest guys in the unit and say, okay, you're on a duster crew, and you're on and of course it was a big joke, but the only way you can fire these weapons is to get 4 or 5 guys up on top to load and fire the weapons. So the only way we're going to help keep the North Vietnamese off of us was there. As it turned out, there was no ground attack from that side, at least. But this attack went from probably for 2 or 3 hours. As it turned out, it was the second heaviest barrage of incoming. I think they counted 1,200 rounds. And I'm not talking about pea shooter rounds, small arms. I'm talking about artillery, big mortars, and rockets. And they counted 1,200 plus rounds that night. I think the only time they had more rounds was the initial attack, which was about 1,300 and some rounds. But by 10 o'clock at night, it was over, and a lot of damage. There were a lot of destroyed bunkers and whatnot. I found out later that I thought there were 5 guys in that bunker that had been killed. They were actually, the CO was killed. He'd only been there a month because he replaced the first one that got his arm blown off. The gunnery sergeant was killed, and the XO was killed. So the whole command of this company was killed. And there were two other guys killed. I thought it was in that bunker. As it turned out, a bunker in front of them also got a direct hit and killed a PFC and a corporal. So there were 5 guys in that company got killed that night. It was pretty horrific, but I didn't find it, and I didn't really know. I knew the captain. I did not really know the XO, and I didn't know the gunnery sergeant. I knew another platoon commander there, but we were always bastards with these units. We were usually 10 guys to ourselves. We talked and we got along and whatnot, but we didn't really know them. We were, other than Khe Sanh, we were always with a different unit every other week. So we never got to know many of them. I probably served with every 3rd Marine Division unit that was with the 3rd Marines during my 12 months there. And knew some of them, but not many. And I didn't know at the time, I don't think I knew more than 1 or 2 of the guys from this company after I left there. But that was the major attack. And that was like the 22nd of March. And of course, the operation to relieve the base began around the beginning of April. And it was called Operation Pegasus. And right around for early in the first week, it got really quiet at Khe Sanh. No incoming, nothing. It was almost as if the North Vietnamese knew the rescue was coming, and they were getting their asses out of there. So if you can imagine 3 reinforced divisions of North Vietnamese making their way out of the area, basically. So there was nothing really going on. There was some rear echelon shooting that was going on, but nothing at the base. And so the Marines were ecstatic. They were out on the tops of their bunkers in lounge chairs, literally. And the first unit that came in, we remember somewhere, I think it was around the 5th or 6th of April. I guess Westmoreland wanted an ARVN division to lead the operation. There were 3 divisions that came up for Pegasus. A crack ARVN division. There was the 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Cavalry. So they wanted the ARVNs to lead the spearhead of this thing. And this afternoon, we see a bunch of black helicopters flying in, and these little guys carrying probably their weight on their back with big packs getting off these and they had nowhere to stay. I mean, there was not extra space. So they moved in with whoever they had to sleep with until the next day when they got it, because it was getting to be dark. And that's what led them. And then, of course, during the whole next week was when the other forward elements, the 3rd Marine Division elements, and the 1st Cav with their hundreds and hundreds of helicopters flew in. The Marines were really pissed off because the 1st Cav was announcing they rescued Khe Sanh. The worst thing you could tell a battalion of Marines was that you rescued them after 77 days of holding off 3 divisions with 5,000 or 6,000 guys. So that they didn't take that very well, but they were all out of there. I remember I woke up probably on the morning of I want to say the morning of the 14th, and there was nobody. There were no Marines there at all. They were gone. They literally had moved out, and I had my guys
overnight.
Yeah, probably either late the previous day or getting ready to leave, and we're out of there by daybreak. And I remember, where are all these guys? I had my guys going in and out of their bunkers checking to see if they left anything, because we had nothing. We were so poorly supplied, and we were lucky if we shared 1 sea ration a day. We were short on water every day. But I remember going down to the west end of the runway, where another company had their first bunker on the east end of the runway, and they had a 50 caliber machine gun in there, and they left it there, which was, I said, wow, we're taking this. And we literally, scrambled up the 50 caliber and brought it back with us. But that was basically it. That morning, we had, my 2 dusters were fully operational. One deuce and a half with the quad 50 mount was operational, but the second one, the one in front of me, had taken a pretty, almost a direct hit about maybe 5 or 10 meters away, and it blew out the manifold of the engine and put a bunch of shrapnel holes in a couple of the machine guns. So we had to tow that one out. We hooked that one up, and we were turned over, ready to go. By 10 o'clock in the morning, we were ready to get the hell out of there. And I remember my battery commander, who I didn't like at all for reasons I won't tell you, but he never left the Dong Ha. He was in his battery command post the whole time. And of course, there's now 3 divisions of friendly forces moving up, so it was relatively safe. He comes riding up in a Jeep with 2 pearl-handled pistols, and he thought like John Wayne. He thought he was John Wayne going to have a photo shoot here. And of course, we're all up on our vehicles, ready to get the hell out of there. And he wants to take pictures. Well, we weren't staying. We just waved at him and just took off. And we ended up being the first convoy out of Khe Sanh in 77 days, literally. All the bridges on Route 9, I don't know if the history of it, but Route 9, which came from Cam Lo, well, actually it came from the ocean, but Dong Ha Route 9 went west all the way to the Laotian border. And Khe Sanh was about, I would say, 8 or 10 kilometers from the Laotian border. But there were 13 bridges between Cam Lo and Khe Sanh that were all blown out. And so they couldn't get anything overland no matter what. But in the prelude to this, rescue, or opening of the gates, basically, the engineers had either repaired the bridges or built pontoon bridges around them, so that the road was now fully open all the way up to Khe Sanh. So we were literally the first convoy going out of there, and I had never been there before. I had never been further west than our Charlie battery was at Camp Carroll, which was just near Cam Lo Village, just beyond Cam Lo Village. And I had never been beyond there. I'd never even been to Camp Carroll. But now for the first time, I'm going back east. It was probably about, as the crow flies, I would say 25 miles, but at roadway 40 some miles back. And we're going out there, and it was the picture was just unbelievable to see. There had been so many bombs dropped by B-52s throughout the siege. I mean, they were flying 24/7. They were the smallest sortie of aircraft that they flew was six B-52s, and they were flying, literally dropping day and night these arc light missions. So the hills around Khe Sanh looked like a moonscape, basically. And in fact, even when we were there, we would get during the day, sometimes we would get coded messages telling us that there was going to be a strike that night, very close to the wire. I think before they were doing this, they couldn't drop bombs closer than 2,000 meters from a friendly position. And because of the situation at Khe Sanh, and because they were so fearful it was going to be overrun, there was a sand table in the basement of the White House, and Johnson every night was down there with the commandant of the Air Force, literally, and they were planning how they were going to handle this thing. And so they were flying B-52 strikes, and on this one of these nights, I remember them telling us, get in a safe bunker. If your bunker isn't really well built, get out of it and go somewhere else, because we're going to drop 500 meters from the wire. Now, 500 meters is awful. If you've ever even seen pictures of an arc light strike, a mile away, the ground shook so hard underneath you, could knock you off your feet. But nothing survived these strikes. They could be a mile long and a half a mile wide, hundreds and hundreds of 500,000-pound bombs, 750-pound bombs. And my biggest fear was if they're dropping it that close to the wire, there were hills around us. And one of these bombs could skip off the backside of the hill, maybe not explode and come right up over the wire, get launched right over the wire. And we were fearful that could happen if they dropped them that close. It didn't actually happen, but they destroyed everything around that base. And, from my perspective and the Marines' perspective, nothing could have, no North Vietnamese troops could have survived that. They were vaporized. So body counts were irrelevant after the siege. I think the official estimates were somewhere close to 20,000 killed. If there were 40,000 soldiers around under those bombs, there were at least 20,000 killed, and probably a lot more. but nobody would ever know because there's nothing left. Even if they were in holes in the ground, there was nothing left. But when we went out the gate, and for about the first, I would say the first 5 to 10 miles, there was nothing green. It was just barren with these huge craters. Some of the craters were 30 feet across, 15 feet deep. And as far as the eye could see, that was what the landscape looked like until you got much further out on Route 9. But, we made the whole trip back all the way to Dong Ha. It took us probably 7 or 8 hours to go 40 miles. But that was my experience at Khe Sanh, basically.
Yeah. So, how much longer were you in Vietnam after that?
Well, we left Khe Sanh on the 14th of April. My first week back, I think we ran security for. They started running convoys back and forth to Khe Sanh because Khe Sanh wasn't closed. We were replaced. In fact, some from our sister battery, Charlie Battery, to follow. They had actually 2 dusters come up. I think they had a couple of quads also just to stay overnight, and then the following day were replaced by 2 duster crews and 2 quad crews that were going to stay there however long. But the base was actually, this was April 14th. It wasn't until the end of June that when they determined they were going to abandon Khe Sanh, and they started in June, literally dismantling it, pulling up the runway, destroying bunkers, literally leaving it like they found it. The guys that were up, and they got shot at every day when they were up there. It wasn't like the artillery one way. They got shot at from Korak and other positions, but they were actually having to destroy their own bunkers. They had no protection. They would sleep at night underneath the dusters between the tracks. They dig little. They used to call them graves. They dig little 1 foot deep the holes that they could lay in underneath the duster. So if a round came close, they didn't get knocked out by shrapnel. But they had, for a couple of weeks, they had no place to stay of safety. But by the time they left, the runway was gone. Everything was gone. It was completely destroyed and bulldozed over. It wasn't green, but it was bulldozed over. And I mean, the Marines that I was with, when they heard that they were going to stop bombing, it was even worse when they heard they were going to tear the base down. The Marines said, "What the hell? What are we doing here? If Johnson's going to stop the bombing, why are we here?" And we were really upset that was going to happen. But and during that time, by the way, if you remember correctly, on April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, and we heard that news, and God, we were thinking, what the hell's going on back in the United States? And then I think it was later on, I think it was I want to say the 9th of June that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. So, in Vietnam, we wondered, what the hell are we doing here? What this crap is going on at home? But you had a job to do. People say, well, weren't you scared? Well, of course, everybody's scared. If you weren't scared, you were either psychotic, crazy, or you were lying. It was just that simple. Anybody that was there had to be frightened. But you weren't paralyzed, frightened. You did your job, even when it was not fun to do. But when I got back, I think the first week we ran convoys back and forth to Khe Sanh with loads of supplies, and it was pretty quiet actually because there were so many units around there. But I went on my R&R actually. I believe it was the first. I want to say the first week in May. I went to Sydney on my R&R, and it was my first time out of there. It was 7-8 months. So, which I really enjoyed. I when I was in Sydney, I really thought seriously about going AWOL. I'm going to be the first officer in the United States Army to go AWOL on R&R. But I had a great time. Wanted to get another trip back, but that didn't happen.
And so, when did you leave Vietnam?
I left Vietnam on toward the end of, I would say around I want to say the 21st of September. It's actually a couple of weeks before I was due to leave. I mean, most of the rest of the time I was there, I know they sent, after I got back from R&R, they sent us down south. They were building a huge 10,000-foot runway for jets. And we were assigned to a CB construction unit that was running pipelines and stuff down there. And I think we spent 5 weeks with the CBs, and that was the best duty I had the whole time I was there, because they really take care of their people there. They work their asses off all day long, but boy, when they get back, they have the best food, they have everything, and they treated us like we were part of their family, actually. So
Because you're providing protection for them.
oh yeah, we'd go out and we'd be there out sweating out in the hot sun all day long while they were laying pipes. We'd come back and get cleaned up. I remember I think the second night I was there, I mean, we're eating sea rations with one of my duster crews, and filthy dirty, and a Jeep comes up with a bird colonel. Was a bird? I think he was a lieutenant colonel. He was the CB battalion commander, and he had his senior NCO with him. And he drives right up to us and gets out of these big tall guy, and he looks at me, he says, "Lieutenant, what the fuck are you doing?" And I said, "Sir, we're having dinner. We're eating sea rations like we always do." And he looks at me, he said, and I'm filthy dirty. He said, "You go get cleaned up and you're coming with me." And he tells his NCO, he says, "You go get a truck and you pick up these guys and you take them back." And he took me back in the Jeep to the officers' mess. And I swear they had like these big trailers that were two big trailers mounted side by side. So it was a fairly large. And I walked in the front door and I thought I was aboard the Admiralty ship for a naval whatever. I mean, it was like a real dining room, with white tablecloths on the tables, and there were Philippine stewards with their towels over their arm. I said, I thought I died and went to heaven. And the first thing he does, there's a little bar over in the corner. And he walks me over to the bar and he picks up a little plastic sheet. He said, "Look, the only thing you have to pay for here is your booze. The beer's on us, everything else is on us. But if you want alcohol, you pay up at the end of the month." I'm thinking, oh my goodness. So, and then we go sit down to dinner and they bring out fresh salads. They had lobster, they had steak, they had all kinds of food. And I found out that they have at their disposal, they have an aircraft, I guess it was a DC-3 or something, and that their special services guy would fly all around the Far East, bringing supplies back. And he brought everything back, and just for this unit. And they had literally everything they could possibly want there. So it was tough duty, but boy, they took care of these kids. When I got back that night, after coming from dinner, it was dark out. And I remember my platoon sergeant comes racing up to me and says, "You won't believe what we just had." I said, "What?" He had been at the NCO mess that they had set up, and it looked probably like the officers' mess. And they just had the same meal that we were eating there. He couldn't believe it. And the kids came back from their mess all saying, "Wow, we just had the best food we've had in Vietnam." So, and then we spent 5 weeks there. So it was really good duty. We didn't care what they wanted us to do, but it was really, really nice duty. And then for, the rest of this was through May and June. July, we were on some offensive operations, some big operations. And most of the rest of the summer into September, we did the same thing we always did. We guarded fire bases at night. We ran convoys during the day, or we supported offensive operations, none of which were terribly eventful, at least, not compared to where I had been the first, 7-8 months of my tour.
Sure.
And I remember my last 5 weeks, they sent me down with I guess there were a couple of dusters. There were 2 dusters down at Camp Evans, which was west of Camp Evans had been the original headquarters of the 101st Airborne, which was west of Phu Bai. Phu was just north of Hue City, but this was a hilltop toward the not the Ashura, but toward the Laotian border. I guess it was the Ashura Valley, but they sent me down to this Camp Evans, which was now taken over by the 1st Cavalry. And it was now monsoons, one of the monsoon seasons. It was raining like crazy all the time. Rain for like 4 weeks, 5 weeks straight. And I remember going up the top of this hill on the roadway. We had a couple of canvas tents set up and two dusters there. I had no orders, by the way. I didn't know why I was there, had no mission. We weren't guarding any positions on the perimeter. We were just there. And no, and I was, I wasn't asking any questions. If they wanted me to do something, they'd send me orders. So we were up there, and all we did all day long was drink beer and play cards. And I remember the first calf was set up right. They had their mess area set up right across the roadway from us. And those, I won't use the word I would use, they wouldn't let us eat in their mess hall. We were eating sea rations 20 yards across the road. They would not let us eat in it. Now, it was raining heavily, and there was a Catholic chaplain who used to come over and drink beer with us. Every day he'd come over and drink beer with us. So one day he was pissed off. He said, how could they do this to you? He said, look, just turn your insignia over, your army insignia. We were wearing raincoats, and put your hood up and whatnot. And we went, scrambling across the road behind him like a bunch of refugees. And we get online because they couldn't tell who we were. And we grab our field rations, whatever they were serving, and go back across the road. And we did this for a couple of weeks. And it never really caught us. But it was a decent time. The only time I ever left there during that 5 weeks was I had a 3/4 ton truck with the 50 caliber machine gun that I confiscated at Khe Sanh mounted in the back. And I would run I would drive. I'd never let my driver drive a truck or a Jeep. If I was in the vehicle, I had to drive it. And I had a heavy foot because I was used to being, on the duster, you want to get from point A to point B, or you're going to get shot at in between. You want to get there as fast as you can. So in this little 3/4 ton truck, I used to drive up. Fubai was probably, God, it had to be 30, 40, 50 miles from Dong Ha. And I would just drive up with my foot on the floor, basically, except for when I had to stop. And just to pick up, mail or supplies or whatever it is and come back. And I did this probably 4 or 5 times during my trip. And then one day I got a message from headquarters, from the battalion commander saying, Lieutenant, come back to the rear area. You're going to take your stuff. You're going to take your stuff to be sent back home, your footlocker and whatnot, down to Da Nang. So they'll ship it home. And then shortly thereafter, you'll go home. So, man, I didn't even have time to say goodbye to anybody. I literally went down there, had my footlocker, took it down to Da Nang. I remember I had queried how I had 2 captured weapons from a major assault we had with an ARVN battalion back probably toward the end of July or early August. And literally I had captured, among the other weapons we captured, I had an AK-47 and an SKS that was still in the Cosmoline, packed in grease from these weapons. We literally caught a battalion of North Vietnamese eating their breakfast at sunup, and just this ARVN division wiped them out, and the dusters, of course, wiped them out. But I was thinking about getting these home and how I could get them home, because I'd heard stories about guys trying to ship weapons home. They'd let them go home, and then they'd wait till they followed them, and then the ATF would come and arrest them. They'd let the weapons go. And some of them were breaking them down and putting in false bottoms in their foot lockers. And I thought, Jesus, is it really worth, getting arrested if I get caught? And I thought the better of it, so I didn't stuff anything in there. Now I go down at Da Nang with my foot locker, and I get on an end of a line in this warehouse, and there's a NCO up front. He sees I'm an officer at the back. He said, Lieutenant, you come up here. Has me come to the front of the line with my foot locker. He said, put that foot locker up on up on the conveyor and whatnot. And he looks at my orders and has his manifest that he's filling out. And he takes this big chalk and he marks on the top of my foot locker, do not X-ray. And I'm thinking, oh shit, I could have gotten my weapons in the bottom of my foot locker. And he knew, he was just anticipating that I had to have a souvenir that I wanted to take home, and he wasn't gonna, get me arrested.
Right.
But I didn't have it, and I sulked a little bit, but it was the better choice.
Well, Bruce, I
left.
Yeah.
I left a few days later. Had nobody to say goodbye to. Didn't see any of my troops. It was like bing, bam, boom. Yeah, I had forgotten to mention that some serious wounding and KIAs that I was exposed to
Is that your
in
phone?
October of '67.
Sorry.
Hang on a second. In October of '67, my battalion commander came up to Cantienne on a bright sunny morning to visit, and no sooner got up on the ridge and he was walking between my battery commander and our chaplain, and the North Vietnamese dropped a 61 millimeter mortar literally right in front of him. Took a piece of shrapnel in his chin, had a major wound in his leg and his artery, and if it weren't for my battery commander and the chaplain, they tourniqueted it, carried two. These were all 3 6-foot plus guys. Carried him back to the helicopter and took him out of there. So that all happened like in a flash. Never did get to do his inspection or visit to our troops. Another incident in Cantienne, we just come off a mine sweep. I told you we went out every morning on mine sweeps. We just gotten back to Cantienne from a mine sweep on a muddy, rainy day, and we're going back, taking my duster back up to position, and there was an M48 Marine tank coming down in the other direction. Narrow road, an impasse. Neither of us could go anywhere. And obviously some North Vietnamese was sitting there salivating and started dropping mortars in on us. And in that case, we just got off the track. But there were several Marines nearby that were wounded. I think at least 1 or 2 may have been killed. I never found out what really happened after that. But another time on a mine sweep a month later in November, we again going along a road, and we rode over and had an explosive detonate literally under my commander's hatch, under the seat, under my track. Launched me out of the commander's hatch, launched some of my guys out of the turret. Fortunately, it was relatively small explosive because it just blew the track off basically, and we were able to put it back on and go on our way. And nobody at the time, nobody was sick. We were banged up. My back hurt like hell, and I remember going over to the corpsman, because we were always with Marines, and I never saw our own medic the whole time I was in Vietnam. But he asked me how I was doing. I said, I can walk, but my back is killing me. And he said, well, when you get back to the rear area, take a couple of APCs and go to bed. And that was the end of it. I never knew what happened to me physically for almost 40 years when I had x-rays of my back and found out I did some serious, spinal damage, because I had ongoing back trouble ever since that day. And two others at Khe Sanh in March after the 22nd issue. We're standing outside of one of my bunkers on a bright sunny day on the 31st of March, and was talking to a new Marine sergeant, staff sergeant, who had just come, a week or two earlier, and again, a North Vietnamese dropped a 61 millimeter mortar, and it landed right behind him. If not for him, I would have gotten hit, but literally took his leg off below the knee. And 2 of the guys carried him over toward Charlie Med. And I had his boot, where literally his foot had been blown off his leg, and ran there after him and handed that to one of the guys to take over with. In some delusion, I thought maybe they'd sew his leg back on or something. But and finally, after we left Khe Sanh, one of the guys that served with me, a young buck sergeant who was one of my squad leaders at Khe Sanh, and he had been there through the whole siege. On the 9th of June, I wasn't with him, but on the 9th of June, he replaced another squad leader from a different section because the squad leader was sick. He agreed to take his position. And he had just had a 3-week-old daughter. He was showing pictures of her and whatnot. But he went out on this operation north on Route 1 toward Jilin, and they got ambushed just below Jilin, and he literally took the first round right in the head, killed him instantly. And I thought of that for almost every day in my life since then. I wasn't with him. What could I have done? Obviously nothing, but those were things that stuck. Those incidents literally stuck with me the rest of my life, and obviously I'll have enough nightmares about them. But those were things that definitely impacted me after I got home. So I think, yeah.
Can we go back to the one? I believe you said it was March 31st. That's the one where the guy's leg got blown off.
Yeah, his name is Sergeant Arnold Ferrari. Been there 1 week. It was like a reserve Marine. He we were literally standing next to one of my bunkers, my quad 50 bunkers. His back was toward the wire, and a couple of his guys were standing alongside of us, and I was facing him.
Uh-huh.
And a 61 millimeter mortar landed right behind him, literally feet behind him, and he absorbed all the blast. Nobody else was even hit, but it literally ripped off his lower leg.
And what were you guys talking about?
We were just, shooting the breeze, basically. Nothing in particular.
And what do
And
you
it was
remember?
like, it was not that long before the base was relieved from Pegasus. It was kind of quiet, really, that week. But this has just happened.
What do you remember about him? Did you know him well?
I didn't know him at all. I had just met him, which is probably the reason I was talking to him. He was probably living right next to us with his guys, his Marines. And we were just talking. He came from New Jersey. I think he was from Atlantic City. I'm not certain of that, but I was a Jersey boy also. So we, literally just shooting the breeze and casual conversation.
What did he look
and out
like?
of the blue, this round came in.
What did he look like? What do you remember?
Oh, geez, I remember he was kind of ruddy skinned. He's an Italian guy, dark hair and whatnot, but he was in his Marine fatigues and whatnot. But I had never met him before. That was the first time I'd seen him, literally.
Yeah. Do you know what happened to him after they got him out of there?
He died. Yeah, he bled out. He didn't even get a medevac. He bled out at Charlie Med. Yeah, he died very quickly.
Yeah. So I'm just looking through my notes from the last time we talked, and we got as far as your trip home, and your missed opportunity to bring home some contraband, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. As I said, I flew out of there. I think it was I want to say the 24th or 5th of September. I had no advance notice other than I knew I was getting close. My battalion commander said, come back here. You're going home. And just like that, I was out of there. Flew back to Dong Ha. Within an hour, I was on a plane. Going down to Da Nang, and on an airplane going home. Several hours later. With
other guys on the plane with you?
Yeah, it was a full plane of mostly Marines, and I remember it was a Pan Am flight. A lot of cute Pan Am stewardesses. Everybody was thrilled. Big cheers when the wheels got off the ground. But it was like a flash. It just happened. All of it happened in literally within a few hours.
And where'd you land?
We landed at SeaTac in Seattle. We landed at SeaTac. That's where I left. I left from Fort Lewis, and I went back to Fort Lewis.
I see.
And kind of a typical rainy day in September. And I remember I was not well. I was sick. I remember walking around in my skivvies when we were getting out, picking up our orders and stuff, and I was really, really sick. I had expected I was going to get orders to go home on leave and then have my next duty station, because I still owed the Army an extra year because I didn't go to flight school.
Yeah.
And of course, I went to get my papers, my orders, and he hands me my orders, and it's a DD 214, and it's discharging me from the military. And I'm looking at this saying, thinking to myself, did they make a mistake or what? But I was kind of thrilled. I just didn't want to say anything. And so, as I said, I was sick. I didn't go home right away. I flew back to El Paso to see my girlfriend.
Oh, sorry. Before we get to El Paso, were you sick on the flight, or did you mostly after the flight?
Yeah, when I got in, I had a kind of a bronchial infection or whatnot, and probably aggravated by the flight. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder what that flight was like. That's a long flight.
Yeah, we flew. It was almost like the reverse of when we flew in there. We flew from Da Nang to Japan, to Yokota, Japan, to refuel. And I remember vividly the pilot getting on and telling that he made several 360s around Mount Fuji. And I had my camera out snapping pictures and whatnot. And I found out later on I had forgot to turn the camera on through all of this, had 0 pictures. But it was that, and then we literally flew all the way back to SeaTac.
Yeah.
But
Was it,
within a period of probably, I don't know, 12 hours from beginning to end. It was, I forget how long the flight was coming back, but
I mean, it's
it,
just I can't. It seems like there must have been some kind of mental or emotional whiplash. I mean, one minute
oh,
you're
absolutely. Well, that's
it worked,
exactly what it was. And
and it must have been like that
I
for the other guys on the flight too. Like, how did you guys talk to each other on that flight?
well, the difference was a lot of Marines went home as a group, as a unit,
Mm,
so they knew each other.
mm,
But in my battalion, we all went back. We came and went as individuals. We never did. We never came over together. We never left together. It was, just plucked right out. Which was, if they ever learned anything about Vietnam, is you don't send guys over as individuals and you send them over with a unit. You have unit cohesiveness. Is a lot of familiarity, other than snatching you right out of the brink, and then all of a sudden you're expected to be back in civilian life, 24 hours later. And it was real. The shock doesn't hit you then, but boy, it sure hits you shortly thereafter. You realize you didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to your own friends, your troops. None of that. There was no closure whatsoever.
and then on
And
top of it, you get to Fort Lewis and find out that you're no longer in the military.
well, yeah, I didn't mind that so much, though. I wasn't eager about spending a third year in the military. I was
Well, I
never going to
mean,
be a regular
there
a
are good
regular
shocks.
army guy.
Yeah, there are good shocks and bad shocks, but it's
Yeah,
still a shock.
yeah, yeah. Well, plus I was pretty sick at the time. When I went back, I flew back to El Paso because that's where my girlfriend. Probably the only reason I was still alive was because I expected to marry her.
Mm.
Otherwise, I would have extended my battalion XO for 5 or 6 weeks, put the hard sell on me. So you can extend for another 6 months. I'll make you captain. You'll double your salary, this and that. And I thought very, very I was really close to extending, but she was there, and I thought I was going to get married. Obviously, that didn't happen. I spent a few weeks, actually, her father was a retired major, checked me into Beaumont Army Hospital, and I spent almost a week in the hospital on antibiotics and whatnot
For the bronchial
before I
infection.
got out. Yeah, I had a bronchial infection, a pretty bad
Yeah,
one actually.
yeah. What was she
But
doing what was she doing in El Paso?
her father's retired, was a retired major, lived right off the base.
Mm.
Um, she went to the University of El Paso at UTEP. It was a lot of the military brats that graduated were going to college were going to UTEP, and they
Yeah.
lived with their parents, either on base or off base if their fathers were still in the military.
Yeah.
But her
So
father was retired.
in any case, that's not the girl you ended up marrying.
No, it's not. No, I was
Yeah.
I was I was pretty much heartbroken, but I left there and then flew home, and I flew home basically as a civilian. I was not in uniform when I flew home, uh, so I had none of the nonsense that went on like out of Oakland with all kinds of demonstrations and what. I flew home. I remember landing in Newark Airport. The airport was empty. The flight was basically empty. My father picked me up at the airport. It was like uneventful, home. And from there, back in those days, a lot of guys, and I'm sure you've heard this from others. We didn't talk about Vietnam at all. I mean, my family didn't want to know about it. They didn't want to know about it when my twin brother came back a little over a year earlier. There was just never any talk about Vietnam. They didn't want to know. Nobody wanted to hear it. And with what was going on in the States, most veterans just kept their mouths shut and went about their lives, did whatever they were going to do. And for the most part, we did it for 30 years. It wasn't short lived.
So when you got back to New Jersey, when your father picked you up at the airport and took you home, in the first few days of being home, what was the biggest difference that you noticed about your town or your community from when you left?
Uh, well, it was a different atmosphere, certainly with regard to the war and what was going on in Vietnam. We were, before we left, we were very much supported by the general population. But that was the year that the Cali thing happened in My Lai, and some other incidents. Johnson announced on the 31st of March that he wasn't going to run for the presidency anymore. They stopped bombing. I mean, that was in and of it was a change in the politics of it. And from our perspective, we thought, what the hell's going on here? Why are we here? If we're not, going to continue trying to win this war.
Mm.
So it was just quiet. I was at home. We had one family event, but it was a very quiet event. No big signs, welcome home, or any of that stuff. It was almost as if nothing had happened. I'd been away on a long vacation,
So
and
all that stuff that you saw, all that stuff that gave you nightmares, I mean, you had nobody to talk to about it.
nobody at the time. No, no. And I was very fortunate because I told you I'd worked summers for a company. Owens, Illinois was the largest packaging company in the world. And within a month after I got back, they contacted me and offered me a job. So I was home, for the month of October, and in November, I took a job in Toledo, Ohio, at their headquarters. I was hired as an inside salesperson, basically a trainee to become, something in their sales organization. And as it turned out, there was one of the other fellows that was hired was a former Marine captain who had just gotten out. He had not been in Vietnam. He was at Guantanamo, but he was a Marine. He knew what was going on, and he was a close friend of mine. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was basically became my psychotherapist, because he listened to me. He knew exactly what I'd been going through. I mean, he'd heard this story before from other Marines, obviously. But I had an apartment that I remember I rented a furnished apartment. Within 1 month after moving into my apartment, there was a fire in the apartment. It was one of these 2.5-story buildings. And the guy underneath my apartment evidently fell asleep with a cigarette on his couch. And I had come back. I was with, in fact, this friend of mine that I worked with, his name was Dan Massey. He and his wife and a girl I was dating at the time had just come back, and we were having a drink before they went home. And Dan and his wife left, and my date and I was just cleaning up, getting ready to take her home, when I heard screams, basically. And I went to the door and I smelled smoke. And my first instinct, because we come in all the way down a hallway from the parking lot, I immediately sent her down that way and to get out of the building. And I ran back into, because there were no flames, it wasn't heavy smoke, but I said, I'm going to get a bucket of water, I'm going to put this thing out. And I ran back to fill up a bucket. By the time I got to the front door, the smoke was from floor to ceiling. Flames were coming up from the lower level. And I just slammed the door shut, soaked the towel, put it over my head, and I literally opened the door and crawled all the way down the same where I'd sent this gal out. It was the only way to get out of the building because the flames were coming right up in the stairwell in front of me, and literally crawled on my belly, to get out of the building. As it turned out, it was a major, very, very hot fire. The fire engines didn't come for what? This is like 1 o'clock in the morning at this point. One of the other guys in the building and I ran across the street. There was a ladder and brought it back, and there was a 70-plus-year-old woman living and screaming. I literally broke her window with my fist, cut my hand, didn't realize how badly, but cut my hand. But we broke her window out and literally carried her out a window to get her out of the building. But there was nobody else, seriously injured in this fire other than the guy who died. And he was probably dead before the fire, just from the fumes and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But now I'm without a place to live, and very fortunately, my friend Dan and his wife asked me to come live with them until I could find another place, which I did. I probably lived with them for 6 or 7 weeks, and as I said, at that time, I didn't know it then. I probably didn't know it for years afterward, but that incident probably saved my psyche more than I ever could have imagined, because I had this guy to talk to, all the time. I mean, I lived with him. He and his wife were ex-Marine family. So young guy, wasn't much older than I, and I just didn't understand. I thought everybody had something like this, somebody you knew you could talk to, because it wasn't your family and it wasn't your former friends. But I didn't seek any other help, and I didn't know I needed any other help. Of course, one of the things I did, as a lot of it, I drank heavily when I got back. I smoked heavily, In Vietnam, I was smoking 4 packs a day. When I got home, I was smoking 3 packs a day because I had 7 or 8 hours worth of sleep. I couldn't light a cigarette. But we always drank. Went out for lunch and drank. Went out at night and drank. Um, basically self-medicated myself. And I worked there I was in Toledo for about 13 months. I was in December, I was transferred to the New York sales office to manage the New York sales office. And so I moved back, and of course I didn't have a place to live. So I lived with my parents in their apartment uh, for several weeks, which probably almost drove me nuts. I mean, it was very difficult living with them. But I finally, one of the guys in my sales office was being transferred to Dallas, and he had this fantastic apartment, a rent controlled apartment on the Upper East Side, and he offered, to literally hand it over to me, and which I gladly took, and I lived in the city for, well, it was that was I guess it was February of 70 that I moved into the city, and I lived there and didn't move out until January of 76.
Okay.
But I worked in the city. Uh,
Yeah, I have to
I,
ask you. I have to ask you. It's really unusual. Um, it strikes me. It strikes me as surprising that you didn't talk to your twin brother about any. I mean, he had been in the same place you were, and you're twins.
yeah, until years later, I didn't realize how strange that was until many years later. My twin brother and I did not talk about Vietnam for 30 years, literally, not for
To each
30 years,
other.
to each other, not one word. I didn't know much about what he did. We didn't communicate. We didn't write letters. Although I wrote with family, I think I never my twin never wrote me a letter. I never wrote him a letter. I wrote letters home to my parents. I think my older brother, actually my sister-in-law, wrote most of his letters, and that was the only family communication. But yeah, it was very strange. My twin brother, by the way, when he went home, he left Michigan State like in his first trimester. He went back to live in Lansing and didn't go to school, but he got a job there, and he lived in Michigan. He worked for Robert. I don't know if you remember Robert Hall Men's Clothes. Maybe you're not old enough to remember them. It was a national men's clothing chain, and he ended up being a manager that would travel around Michigan and open up new stores. So I was in Toledo and he was living in Lansing. So on Friday nights, often I would just I bought a car when I got up there, and I would drive up to visit him. So, and even through all of that, we never talked about Vietnam. Even our visits, we talked about everything else but Vietnam. So, I attribute it. We weren't very close, as kids. By the time we were 10 or 12 years old, we had different friends, did different things, never did anything together. He was kind of a black sheep. He would do something and get in trouble for it. He'd always get caught. He would always get caught. He was smoking at 9 years old, and strangers, people who lived blocks away, would see him walking down the street and write anonymous letters home to tell my parents he was smoking. But I never smoked, but I did just as many stupid things as he did. I just didn't get caught,
I
and
see.
he'd get caught all the time. But we were just not close, not through high school, not, obviously he was in the military when I was in college. So the closest we probably were was when I got back, and I used to make weekend trips up to
Yeah.
Michigan to spend
Well,
the
I don't mean to
weekend.
belabor it. It's none of my business really, but I just find it fascinating that, even though you weren't close, at the time when you guys came home, like you said, you couldn't talk to your family. There was nobody to talk to. And then, a year and a half or, later, you now have something in common that most people
Yeah.
can't understand. And I talk to a lot of veterans who say that when they came home they couldn't talk to anybody who hadn't been there. Like, you had to have
Well,
been there.
yeah,
Well, you
that's
and your
exactly.
brother were both there, and you're twins.
I guess the way I treated it, I'm not sure how he viewed it at the time, but the way I treated it was he was just another civilian basically by that
Mm,
time, even though he'd been through the experience.
mhm.
It was a very different experience from mine, but it was still kind of harrowing for him. But I guess it's because we were never close.
Mhm.
We just didn't
Mhm.
see eye to eye on anything. And the closest we ever were those, Friday night to Sunday visits.
Mhm.
And I traveled to probably 5 or 6 different towns in Michigan when he was moving around the state. But yeah, for many years, I didn't do anything other than my contact with Dan Massey, the former Marine. I was a Vietnam closet veteran. I mean, I didn't do anything, with veterans activities, nothing at all. I just kept a low profile. Um, and from my knowledge, that's what most guys did, at least combat veterans did. And so I was in Toledo for a year, and then when I moved back to New York and I had my apartment, I went through my hippie stage. I was drinking, I was smoking. Uh, I think I quit smoke. I quit smoking early in the year I was in Toledo, and because I was always getting these bronchial infections all the time, and I quit cold turkey. I'd go to the bar and everything, and they say, "Oh, you don't want to drink when you're quitting smoking and whatnot." And I took that as a challenge. I would have a drink in each hand, so I couldn't hold a cigarette, basically. And
Mhm.
but I did quit smoking cold turkey, and I was proud of it. But when I moved back to New York, living with my parents for a couple of months, going out drinking again all the time, I was in a bar one night and I grubbed a cigarette from somebody, and then it
Mhm.
started smoking again, and didn't quit then probably for another year or more. And I quit then out of vanity because some girl once, a girl I was dating, looked me straight in the eye and told me what a filthy, dirty habit cigarette smoking was. And she never said a word about smoking before that. It was like she punched me in the face. And I
Mhm.
realized she was right, and I quit smoking again, and that was the end of it forever. And I
Mhm.
eventually, early on when I moved to New York, because we would drink, I'd go out for lunch. I'd have 3 martini lunches with my boss and customers. I'd go out at happy hour afterwards or out at night drinking with friends. And after about a year or so of that, I would come into, I worked I don't know if you know the Chrysler building in New York.
Mhm.
We had offices on the 47th and 48th floor of the Chrysler building.
It's my favorite
Uh,
building in New York.
yeah, it's a great building. And I lived uptown. I could take the subway down. I literally could walk underneath, didn't have to go outside to get the subway until I get uptown. And because I lived up on 81st Street. But I worked there, but I would come into work mornings, and I would have the DTs for 2 or 3 hours from having literally drunk so much the night before. And after a couple of months of that, I finally realized this is terrible. I can't keep doing this, and I stopped drinking. Just stopped cold turkey. I'd go out to lunch with my boss or with customers, and I'd order a Shirley Temple or a vodka Collins with not a vodka Collins, but a Collins with no alcohol in it. And
Mhm.
after about 2 weeks, I flushed the alcohol out of my system. I felt great. I said, boy,
Yeah.
glad I did this. And I didn't drink for a number of years, not even socially after that. I didn't as much as have a beer.
But I'm
But
guessing, I mean, the problem is, right, you mentioned that the reason you were doing all that drinking and smoking was to self-medicate. So
absolutely, no doubt about it.
once you stop self-medicating,
Yeah.
how does this stuff come out?
Well, yeah, then I was kind of, I had friends who were, half of them were hippies, some of them weren't, no military friends. I was kind of an enigma to people that I hung out with. And I let my hair grow longer than it should have, working for a conservative, company, corporate company. And, but I didn't do heavy drugs, but I certainly did weed and experimented a couple of times. But it was, it was just that kind of downhill progression, to, again, another way of self-medicating, I guess.
Mhm.
And I wasn't drinking alcohol at the time, so that was the alternative for me.
I see.
And not very long after that, probably maybe a year later, I decided to go look for help because I realized I'm having these nightmares all the time, and I'm doing these kind of self-destructive things. And I ended up going. A friend of mine mentioned there was a clinic, the Payne Whitney Clinic up at Cornell Hospital uptown, and that they had it was kind of a pay what you could kind of a situation. You didn't have to. Uh, and I had insurance. I had health insurance that covered. some of it. But I went up there, and I was literally going twice a week for probably over a year to see a therapist. And
And did this therapist have any combat experience or experience
no,
talking to
none,
combat veterans?
not at all, none, no. But and after a while, it was kind of the same routine over and over again, and we just rehashed the same stuff. And I realized this guy had nothing in common with me, and probably was not the right guy to be talking to. At the time, during that time, I during the winter, my friends and I would rent ski houses in Vermont,
Hmm.
and in the summer we rent beach houses out in the Hamptons. And for a couple of years we did that, and then in I guess it was probably in '72, the May of '72. Um, I met my future wife, actually, through a friend of mine. We went out to look at a beach house in May that we were going to rent out in Amagansett, one of the towns out in the Hamptons. And so I met her there. We didn't get along at all when we first met her, and just total opposites. And but we started seeing each other occasionally, and we started dating afterwards. And I married her the following April, 11 months later.
Hmm.
And so she lived with me in the city until 1976. I moved out of there in January '76. I realized we wanted to have a family, and I didn't want to raise a family in Manhattan. Although I wish I had that apartment. I had probably one of the greatest apartments in New York. This place was, when my friend had originally taken it, it was a one bedroom place, which they'd literally stolen half of the apartment next to it to make a huge bedroom. We had a foyer, and the guy who had it before him convinced the landlord to let him stay while he was renovating part of the building. So he built a spiral staircase down into the basement and refinished the whole area underneath his apartment in the basement. He had stucco walls and flagstone floors, and this apartment had the only access to the backyard behind this building and the one next to it. It was
Mm.
a walled-in backyard. It was a private backyard, basically. He also had a storeroom outside of his basement that he had the only access to. And I had this great apartment. When I was single, we used to have incredible parties there during the summer and whatnot. And then my wife moved in, and it was a wonderful place. But it was rent controlled. I think I was paying a little over $300 a month. The apartment could have gone for $3,000 even back then. But we ended up moving out. I had nothing to I couldn't get any money for it other than what I sold my furniture in there for. But the fellow who bought it still lived there 25 or 30 years later. They converted it to a condo or operation.
Mhm.
But we moved up to Westchester County to New Rochelle. And I know I remember having sent my wife out looking for houses. And she, you know, it was not cheap up in this area, but she found a house that somebody was in a hurry to leave because they were being transferred. And she said, let's go up and see it. I went up and saw it, and I said, look, there's no reason not to buy it. Everything was in working order. It was in move-in condition. And I said, this will be our starter house. And as it turns out, it's still our starter house.
Is
We've
that
been here
right?
for we've been here for 45 years.
That's
So
amazing. Yeah,
yeah,
one of my best friends actually lives in New Rochelle. I haven't been
is
to
that
he
right?
yeah, he used to live out here, and I haven't been to visit him. He comes out here pretty frequently, so I get to see him when he's in Seattle.
Hmm.
I have not been to visit his house in New Rochelle, but I've seen pictures. It's a beautiful area.
Yeah, New Rochelle was kind of many years ago was kind of a bedroom community, and it was probably the first one that was really growing, and had an incredibly good school system, which is why we came here. Uh, the school system was ranked very highly all along. We were always sending high school graduates to the Ivy League schools, and it was a very large school. New York, there were over 3,000 people in this high school, but
Hmm.
it was extremely a good place to raise kids to go to good schools. And both of my kids went through public schools in New Rochelle and did extremely well.
Hmm.
But as I said, we moved there in January of '76, and my wife got pregnant sometime in the next 12 months. And my oldest son was born in June of 77. And so that was my first one, David. And my second son was born in November of 80. And they went through the high school. My oldest son was scary smart. He was just in, I didn't, I, as a father, I didn't realize how smart. My wife knew because she was a teacher.
Hmm.
And she knew how smart he was. He was reading when he was 2 years old. I mean, he would pick out words and stuff, and I would say, "Well, he just memorizing words and stuff." But he was brilliant, and he didn't get it from me. But he was near the top of his class in high school. He ended up going to MIT. Always wanted to be a veterinarian, and so he went to MIT because he figured if he was a biology major from there, that he had more slots that he could get into at Cornell Vet School if he weren't a Cornell undergraduate, because they saved like 20 spots for their undergraduates, and then there were 60 spots for everybody else. So he
Hmm.
figured, well, why would I want to compete for 1 out of 20 when I can compete for 1 out of 60? You
Right.
know, and
Right.
he did extremely well at MIT and got an early acceptance to vet school at Cornell.
Mm.
And he is a veterinarian. He's a veterinary neurologist and neurosurgeon.
Wow.
And he's out in California now.
Well, so let's come back to you. So,
Sure.
you have all of this kind of trauma that's suppressed, right? I mean, you came home and you
Absolutely.
self-medicated for years. Was there a point at which and you tried therapy, but maybe with the wrong therapist?
Yeah.
Was there a point at which all of this sort of bubbled up for you?
Uh, well, because I was seeing it, I didn't realize at the time. I figured it out shortly thereafter. But obviously, my insurance company from my job was paying for my shrink visits, even though they weren't a lot of money. I was filing for my insurance to pay for it.
Hmm.
And after time, obviously, this somehow got back to my boss in New York, and it was back in those days, people didn't go to see a shrink and advertise it.
Right.
It was not terribly acceptable, and so it ended up costing me my job, and I'm convinced it was for that reason, because there was no other cause for it. I mean, I was fairly good manager and whatnot, but I lost my job, I believe, sometime. I think it was, I want to say 72, or maybe the beginning. It was probably late in 72, because I got married in 73. But I found a job a month later. I went to work out on Long Island. It was a bit of it. I didn't have a car at the time, so I had to buy a car and travel out to Woodbury, Long Island. And I worked for a very successful corrugated packaging company that made commercial industrial boxes and stuff, triple wall boxes. And when I worked for them for about 12 years, commuting out to the islands. And so during that time, uh, I pretty much, I didn't do anything with veterans groups. Occasionally I would go on Veterans Day or Memorial Day. They'd hold a ceremony at City Hall, but I didn't really do very much then. My kids always got involved on those days. They both played trumpet in the band in different years, and they would always play taps at these ceremonies. So that was like the closest thing I had to a military event. Is that right? I still have their trumpets in my attic, but they haven't continued that, obviously. But at any rate, I was always asked. I'd go to these things, and somebody from the American Legion would come over and say, "Why don't you come and see us and join us and whatnot?" And all I remember is when I came back from Vietnam, the American Legion didn't want to have anything to do with Vietnam veterans. They spit on us literally, and the VFW wasn't much better. So I stayed away from. I didn't want anything to do with that stuff. Many years later, the same guy who'd been trying to hit on me to join for all those years, when he finally kind of ticked me off, and I said to him, "Look, there's a reason I don't want to join." I said, you didn't want me or any of my Vietnam veteran brothers, 30 years ago. Now, because you're struggling to get members, you're looking for people to help pay the bills, and it's the last thing I wanted to do. But they really were and they were worse to Korean War veterans than they were to Vietnam veterans. It was even worse. But they were kind of drinking spots, so I didn't need another place to go drink. Uh, but I didn't really do much of anything. When I worked for this company out on the island for 12 years, I was in charge of all the inside sales. I had salesmen working for me. Um, I was I was a director of marketing basically, but I also handled all their government business. And every few months, I would travel down to DC to GSA because they would put bids out for packaging and whatnot. And I used to really keep the industry, keep them sticking with the specs because we were the leader. And even though we didn't get a lot of the business, we were not competing for price. We just kept them honest with regard to specifications and whatnot. But I remember the first exposure back in, I guess it was 81 when the wall was being constructed.
Mm-hmm.
I knew of it, and on my way back to the airport to Reagan Airport, I'd stop over at this construction site, and basically it was a muddy. There were no walkways. There was nothing. I think by the time I got there, the plaques were the walls were up, the names were on it, but nothing else was finished. And I remember going over there one day in the rain, pouring rain, trudging through mud. I had mud up over my shoes, and I'm looking over names up and down as many as I could read, and I'm looking to find the names. This particular guy who was killed, my guy was his name was Manuel Martinez, and I couldn't for the life of me remember his last name. I knew he was a Mexican American. I was looking at every possible, Mexican name I could find, but there were no directories. And I remember just crying my eyes out in front of this wall because I felt so helpless. I wanted to honor him. I wanted to at least see his name. I knew he would be on the wall. And after that, I didn't do much of anything. I did watch in 82 when the wall was dedicated. The dedication was on television. I remember watching it on television, and at the end they had the credits running, and I remember seeing the name of my units. There were dusters, quads, and searchlights, and that's what they were called at the time. And there was a line. They were one of the people who laid a wreath at the ceremony at the time. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that's my unit. Where the heck are they? And I was going to, and like anything else, I was going to look them up and try and see if I could contact anybody. But of course, it was out of sight, out of mind, and I didn't do anything about it for years. I never tried to contact anybody. But I had a lot of issues. I had anger issues going through a lot of this stuff. I kind of road rage driving. I wasn't drinking, but I was angry. And my wife started going to the vet center to see this not psychiatrist. They had psychologists or social workers or what. And she used to take my kids there in the late 80s and into the early 90s. I just wouldn't go near the place. I didn't want to have anything to do with the VA or even the vet centers that were run by them. But somehow they got me involved. I think they had a Saturday session on whatchamacallit. What do they call it? Heart compressions. I'm having a senior moment.
CPR.
CPR. They had a CPR course, and my youngest son and she and I went to this course. That's how they got me to get into the vet center. And I knew the guy. I knew the guy that he was a Marine veteran who was there when I was there. He was a Silver Star winner and whatnot. And he had a PTSD group, and for years he tried to get me to come in, and I wouldn't come in. But somehow after this event, he talked me into coming to one of the meetings, and there were a few guys he had in the session he was doing with us. There were only like 3 or 4 of us, but he had another group, and they were all combat veterans, Marines, Army, all combat veterans. And in the second group, we formed up, and we ended up having probably 15 guys in the group. All of us became, by the time they broke this group up, every one of us had 100% service-connected disabilities. He helped every guy get their compensation benefits and whatnot. I did mine myself only because I'd spent so much time avoiding this place. I knew everything that I had to do. I just didn't do it, and I didn't need him to do it for me. I had all the names, dates, places, and events, whatnot, to put into a report. And so during that period, I ended up starting to go to the VA. I ended up, putting in applications for compensation and whatnot. And I don't know if you're interested in hearing it. It was a thing a lot of vets didn't do. Because there were more vets getting turned away with their tail between their legs because of the bureaucracy, and they put them through so much crap. When I went the first time, I didn't know it at the time. I saw a shrink, Eastern European guy. I spent like an hour and a half with him, and I found out later nobody was in those meetings for an hour and a half. And I laid my guts out to this guy. And when I walked out the door, he said, "Mr. Geiger, you have a chronic, severe case of PTSD." He said, "However, I'm not sure they're going to give you any money." And I'm thinking to myself, well, how does that come about? And basically it was because I'm a college graduate. I'm fairly well spoken, articulate. I express myself. All the paperwork was, the I's were dotted, the T's. And from that, he was thinking, I've got my head together. So, I'm in pretty good shape. I was an officer. And, as it turned out, I ended up getting an award of 30% for PTSD. And at the time I thought, well, there are guys getting turned away, or they get a slap on the wrist, maybe get 10%. I said, that doesn't sound so bad. And I just, I took whatever the 30% was. And for a couple of years, I basically, didn't object until I found out that, I should have done more. And I reopened my case. I provided more information. I was seeing by that time, I was seeing a VA shrink. I had started seeing a private shrink through my vet center with a psychologist who used to work for the VA. Somehow he had a slush fund where he could spend money on that for guys who couldn't get to a hospital or couldn't get to a VA shrink, and there was nobody using it. So he sent me to this woman, and I ended up seeing her at the same time I was seeing the other guy. And in the next year or so, I got my benefit. My ratings were increased to, I think, first to 50% for PTSD, and then later on I ended up getting 100% for PTSD. I got coronary artery disease years before it ever became a presumptive ailment, and something for hypertension. So I was at 100% by the time I left out the part. After I left corporate America, I kind of did a few other things, and eventually got my master's degree in teaching. My wife one day, because I was sitting around moping and I didn't have a job, and she said, why don't you get your master's degree and teach? And I thought to myself, my father, who was a phys ed teacher for 40 years, probably would be spinning in his grave if he heard one of his kids became a teacher. But my wife was a teacher for many years. And after a while I said, I love kids. Maybe that would be a good idea. And, my kids were now growing up. This was kind of the late 80s. And so I decided to take part in this fellowship program, and I was accepted into a fellowship program. It was a 15-month course, and I got my master's degree, and ended up teaching in a probably the largest ghetto neighborhood in the Northeast Bronx, in a public school. I was the only male teacher in the school. So I started my career, which actually ended up lasting 11 years. I taught for 11 years, taught 9 years in that school. I taught fourth grade, and I loved it in the beginning. I really loved the kids. I was a pretty good teacher, actually, but what I couldn't handle was the authority. I didn't handle poor leadership in the military or in any of the corporate jobs I had. If there was somebody who was really not competent doing the job over me, I had a lot of trouble with authority. But at some point, it ended up, causing me to decide to get out of one school. And I ended up going to teach in the school my wife was in, because I knew her principal, I knew the district superintendent and whatnot. And I spent my last 2 years teaching in her school. So, I had an 11-year career, but by the time I'd been teaching 11 years, the system had gotten very abusive to teachers to begin with. And I was 48 years old when I started teaching. So, I'd been around the block a few times, and all these young kids were who had no tenure and whatnot. They were really abusing young kids, and they were leaving after 2 or 3 years because they didn't want to put up with that. My wife and I, having had a lot more experience, we would shake our heads yes, and we do our own thing. And my kids always, my 9 years in one school, my kids always finished at the top of the grade. And even in my wife's school, I taught fourth grade. My kids finished ahead of her fourth grade class. So, we would just close the door and we would do some of what they wanted us to do, but we would, and when it didn't work, we do our own thing and taught the kids what they needed to know. But it got so abusive after a while. I finally said to my wife, we got to get out of here. I said, for every year we spend in this system, it's going to take 5 years off our lives. And she didn't want to leave for another couple of years. So but I said, let's find out what it's going to cost for you to leave this year. And as it turned out, I think we went to see the pension guy, and he punched it out on his computer. He said, "Oh, it costs about $150 a month." And I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and doled out $150 to my wife. I said, "Here's the first installment. We're leaving this year." Uh, but eventually, we did leave. I ended up not on a regular retirement. The fellow we were seeing, the last, I guess, brought our papers in one day. It was the last 5 minutes before we was, finished with him. And somehow the military came up. He'd never asked me about. He said, "Yo, you were in the military." I said, "Yeah, I was in the Army." He says, I was in Vietnam. He said, "Do you have a service-connected disability?" And at the time, I think I was 50% service-connected. He said, "Well, maybe we should be putting you in for a disability retirement." And I looked, I said, "Well, what's that going to do?" Punches it out on his computer. He says, "It's going to double your pension." I was going to get a small pension under $10,000 a year. He's going to double your pension. I said, "What do I have to do?" He said, "Just rip up those papers. We'll start this process." What I didn't realize is I wouldn't have bet there were any other veterans teaching in the system. But as this thing matriculated, my case, I had such good paperwork. I had 2 inches thick between psychiatrist reports and stuff. And it was all extremely well documented, names, places, dates. And by the time I was ready to turn in my papers, I went in and I spoke to the woman who was sitting at this disability desk. And I said to her, I schmoozed a little bit. I said, "Is there any way we can kind of move this along?" I said, "I know sometimes it takes years to get a New York State disability." She looks through my papers. She said, "Mr. Geiger, just wait a couple of minutes." She goes back to the computer, spends a couple of minutes there, comes back to me with my papers. And she looks me straight in the eye and said, "Mr. Geiger, you're going to come back here at the end of this month, and everything's going to be taken care of." And I looked and I said, thinking, what does that mean? I said, "What do you mean?" She looks me straight in the eye again, and she says, "Everything." I didn't know what was happening. I had no clue. But came back on the end of the month, and I didn't know it until then, but they were using my case basically as a test case for the entire New York City system with regard to veterans and veterans' disabilities. And I went into, there were 3 doctors in the room. I went in there, they asked me 3 questions that had nothing to do with my disability, nothing to do with education. Doctor turns around and asks the other 2, "Do you have any other questions for Mr. Geiger?" And he says, "No." And he reaches his hand out. And he says, "Mr. Geiger, best of luck to you." And I did not know what had just happened. I wasn't there 3 minutes. And the administrative guy said, I said, "What happened?" He said, "You got your disability." And I couldn't believe it. But he said, "You'll get the papers next week." I said, "Well, my school secretary, this is her last day. It's the end of June. She's not going to be around for 2 months." I said, "Can I wait for the papers?" He said, "Oh, yeah, you got 15 minutes. I'll get your paperwork done." Got it done, took it up to my secretary. But between the end of June and early December, I got not only my New York State disability, I took all that paperwork and submitted it as evidence to the VA of my condition. And at the same time, like a week later, went to Social Security. I had a veteran friend who worked for Social Security, and we filled out an application there. And within a month, I got contacted by Social Security that my disability was approved. And then within a month after that, I get notified from the VA that I got my 100% plus disability. So by December, I had all 3 disabilities. I was actually making more money by a lot than I was making as a teacher, I mean, when I started teaching, I had been making triple what I got paid as a teacher, in corporate America. But of course, people don't go into teaching for the money. There isn't any money in it. But by the time I retired, I was making more money than I ever made as a teacher, and it was fairly comfortable. Of course, the VA pensions are not taxable, so it was a substantial, benefit. So that was pretty much my career. I started when my kids were younger. There was a great nature center in Scarsdale, not right nearby, and I used to take the kids to the nature center, and it was a great place. And then as they got older, they decided they didn't want to go anymore, and I was missing it so much. I started volunteering there myself, and I spent about 20 years volunteering. I was on their board of directors probably for 13 or 14 years. And when I retired from teaching, I decided 12 or 14 years is enough time to having done this. And although I wanted to continue volunteering, I decided to do something else. I went to work and volunteered at the Guiding Eyes for the Blind, which was located, their headquarters were in Yorktown, but I went up to work at their breeding center where they breed their guide dogs. And I started volunteering there in beginning of 2005. And with a couple of hiatuses in between, including this pandemic, I've been volunteering there since 2005, 16 years. So I do a lot of volunteer work. With regard to the military stuff, I told you I'd gone to the wall and heard of this, but one Christmas, I think back in 95, I want to say 95, just before Christmas, I got a call from a fellow who was in one of our units. He was in a searchlight unit actually in Vietnam. And this guy was a computer guru. And I didn't know him from Adam, but by the time I spent an hour on the phone with this guy, didn't know him, but by the time I got off, he'd given me several telephone numbers of people to contact, including my XO from my unit in Vietnam. And in the next 2 days, I must have spent 8 hours on the phone with two or three guys, and ended up in April of '96. I ended up going to my first reunion we had an organization called the Duster Squads and Searchlights, which had actually started shortly after the wall was built. And in fact, this past year, we held our 38th annual reunion. So that was my first, I came out of the closet that year. My wife didn't recognize me after that. I went to the reunion, and that July, because some of these guys are also Khe Sanh veterans, took me to a Khe Sanh veterans reunion in Philadelphia. And that was my first exposure to that organization. Now, that was 96 also. That was the summer of 96. After that, every Veterans Day, we'd go down to the wall. We've been laying wreaths at the wall for both the Khe Sanh veterans and the Duster Squads and Searchlights for well over 30 years. And which is probably the reason you heard about me. This past year was the first year that I haven't been, well, actually the last 2 years, because of the pandemic. But I also in the Duster Squad and Searchlights organization, I was an officer for many years. A few of us took over the organization in 2008, and I became the first president of the revived organization. At the Khe Sanh veterans, after I think in '99, they twisted my arm to be on the board of directors there. And I've been on the board of directors there for the better part of 20 plus years as well. So, but we do a lot of volunteer stuff. We do a lot of fundraising. I don't know if I mentioned to you earlier that
you went almost 40 years of not being
yeah,
involved in anything.
well, certainly
Vietnam
30
veteran
years.
related. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
yeah, that's right. 30 years. You're right.
30 years. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, my first reunion was 28 years after I left Vietnam.
And so,
That was,
what has that meant to you? I mean, how has that? You said your wife said you changed so much, you were unrecognizable.
yeah, because I
In
got
what
involved
ways?
with people. I had even people I didn't know in Vietnam, although
Right.
some of them were part of the organization. You know, it's like having, when you first got back, you had nobody to talk to. All of a sudden, you're meeting groups of guys who may not have known in Vietnam, but there is no question about, you know, your position. You understand each other without knowing each other. You know, you're accepting each other automatically because you know what the other guy had to have gone through much of what you went through. And it was like having I was closer. I became closer with these guys, particularly my Duster friends, than I am with either of my brothers. Um, Again, I should have had more of a relationship with my twin brother. My older brother wasn't in combat, but he was in the military. But we just never had the same kind of relationship as I have with my veteran brothers. And of course, it became the same way with my Khe Sanh brothers. I was one of the few Army guys. There were only a couple of hundred Army guys out of the 5,000 or 6,000 that were at Khe Sanh. But you know, I met some guys that I didn't know then, who I served with on their line, including a couple of the officers. But it's just become I've been very much involved with both of the organizations. We do my Duster Quad and Searchlight. The organization is called National Duster Quads and Searchlights Association. We're a 501c19 charitable organization. Years ago at the wall in Vietnam, we used to escort Gold Star mothers. We used to have a very close relationship with them back in the certainly in the 90s. And I remember one Veterans Day, a couple of them had come to us. They were kind of trying to twist our arm to find a way to get them to be able to visit Vietnam, to go back to Vietnam with us. And one of our guys kind of took the bull by the horns and started working on stuff. And eventually we set up we did a fundraising operation, probably raised close to $80,000. I'm sure I raised 15,000 of that 80,000 between the Khe Sanh veterans and other veterans I know. And we ended up taking, over a period of 11 years, we ended up taking 23 mothers and one Gold Star father back to Vietnam. I went on the first trip that we sponsored in 2000. We took 4 mothers back. There were five guys and one wife escorted them. And we raised the money so that their trips cost them nothing, from door to door, meals, hotels. We paid our own way, all of our own expenses. Probably cost us each close to $3,000. And so the first group we took back, and you know, we were escorting them. We were kind of supposed to be their support system. But you know, unbeknownst to us before we went, by the time we got there, they were every bit as much of a support system for us as we were for them. They were like our you know, they were like mothers to us basically, and we were like their surrogate sons. But we took each of them back as close, in some cases, right to the spot their son was killed, literally. We took each of them back to whatever area their son was, wherever it was in the country. We did a lot of research ahead of time. And we held little ceremonies there and whatnot. And in fact, we had a tradition on the 5 trips that we made where we would literally we'd lay flowers and whatnot on a particular spot in a little circle, and the mother and one of the escorts would stand in that circle, and the mothers described it as, I'm walking in my son's footsteps, literally walking in my son's footsteps. And to them, you never have closure after losing a child. I don't care how old you are or when it happened. But for them, they knew so little about what happened to their sons, that all of a sudden they understood a lot about this country and what we went through, and we saw a lot of the country. But we visited all of these places. I stayed an extra week because one of our guys didn't get to hit the place he had served at. So the mothers went home with several of our guys, and 2 of us stayed with this third guy and traveled around the rest of the country. But we made 5 trips. I made the 4th trip back. We had a second trip that year. Later in the year, we had a trip earlier in 2004, and I went on the 4th trip in the late summer of 2004. We took 6 mothers back on that trip, and then we had to put a hiatus on it because of the SARS epidemic in Vietnam. We were supposed to take another group, but we couldn't do it. The mothers were all up in their 70s, some of them in their 80s, and they were not going to get health clearances to go into Vietnam. But in 2011, one of my friends, he had been on an earlier trip, decided that he was going to take the last. There were three more Gold Star mothers who had medical clearance and whatnot that wanted to go back, and he took back the last three moms um, back on the fifth trip. So it was a for us, it was a major event. I mean, it was very cathartic for those of us who were escorting them. There are a lot of guys that don't want to have anything to do with Vietnam, but I know I left Vietnam feeling like we abandoned the Vietnamese. We surely weren't losing a war at that point in time, but we abandoned them. Basically, we stopped supplying them. The Congress just decided they weren't going to continue. But going back for me was very cathartic, because here after 20 some years, I'm traveling a country and seeing one of the most industrious groups of people in the world. Vietnam by that time was growing faster than almost any other country in the world. They had all kinds of development going on, and by 2004 it was even more unrecognizable because there had been so much done. But
Did you ever get back to Khe Sanh?
oh yeah, both trips.
Both trips.
On the first trip we went back, I have some photographs of it with the moms. But the first trip we went back, they had this little kind of it was a makeshift museum, and they were pointing out the old where they said the runway was, the original runway, and those of us who had been there. I mean, I had etched in my brain the geography that I looked at every day for 7 weeks. And I knew that was not the runway. I didn't care what they were telling me. I went hunting with one of my buddies who was in my unit, actually. We went hunting to see where this runway could. When we went all the way to the northern perimeter, we realized it had to be here, but we couldn't really find it. We couldn't find our positions because it was totally overgrown. But we knew it was there. And I remember digging up plastic bags full of red clay to bring back as souvenirs, for the other guys. But by the time I got back on the fourth trip, 4 years later, we had one of our Khe Sanh guys was a civil engineer, and he'd been working in Vietnam building roads and bridges and stuff. And he had exactly the same reaction the first time he went to visit Khe Sanh. He said that is not where the runway was. But he had all of his scopes and his engineering equipment, and he basically did a survey, and he found out exactly where the runway was, because he went over, literally stood over it, dug down until he hit asphalt where the runway had been, and he realized that was where it was. And this other runway, we found out later in 1971 when they reopened, because Khe Sanh was abandoned in 1968, in July of 68. But it was back in 1971 where they were preparing for the Lamsang 7-something-16, huge urban multi-division operation. They not only rebuilt the old runway, but they rebuilt another runway that kind of diagonally went across, and they made it look more like an real airport, where there were actually 3 runways. And the runway they'd been showing us was the newest one from 71, not the older one. But by that time we'd had maps that were redrawn and whatnot, so we knew exactly what had happened. And they built it by 2004. They built a nice museum there, and it was kind of a show place for the North Vietnamese. But it was a very cathartic experience for us. There were still a few mothers that are alive. Not too many of them are still alive, but we communicated with them every year. We met them down at the wall on Veterans Day oftentimes and whatnot. But I still send Christmas cards to a handful of them every year. So interesting relationship for sure.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you all day again, but I have Dennis Mannion in 15 minutes. So
well, Dennis is a great one to talk to, because he's, as I said, he's very well spoken. He's been back to Vietnam as well.
Yeah, and his memory is so detailed. I mean, it's
absolutely, yeah. And he has a very different perspective, having been up on the hills.
Right.
I'd never been up on the hills, but his story is unique, fascinating story. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
So I'm gonna go. I'm gonna have to cut. I'm gonna have to cut us off now because I got to go. I got to feed my dog and get a glass of water before I spend them.
yeah.
Probably the next 2 hours on the line with Dennis. But I appreciate again your how generous you are with your time and
Well,
your memories
I,
and
I, I think some of us, unfortunately, a lot of veterans don't want to talk about Vietnam. I personally think it's the healthiest thing any of us can do. It becomes a very cathartic experience every time we talk about our stories. It helps relieve us of some of this burden that we carry around. And I think Dennis would tell you the same thing.
yeah.
The more you talk to other people about it, the easier it gets to, to live with your demons. And so I hopefully you'll appreciate his story as well. I certainly appreciate the opportunity.